Hey guys, tonight we drift into the golden glow of royal chambers, the kind you've probably seen in films but never really believed could exist. Picture this. Tall candelabras throwing slow, flickering shadows onto ceilings, painted with gods who look just a little too smug. Thick carpets swallowing your footsteps, and the air thick with beeswax, rosewater, and the faint tang of polished metal. You're moving through a palace where history has worn grooves into the marble and where gossip moves faster than the wind through an open courtyard. Every velvet curtain, every silver-gilded door hides another scene in the never-ending play of power. Here, kings and queens rarely married for love. More often it was for land, armies, and treaties. You probably wouldn't survive this game without making enemies before your first week was over. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And drop your location and local time in the comments. I love knowing where in the world you're listening from. Now dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. You glide past open doorways where courtiers bow low, but their eyes dart to watch you. It's a dance of glances here. No one says what they mean, but everyone says something with the way they stand. In the throne room, gold leaf curls over carved panels, and at the center sits a king who knows exactly how much power he holds. His wife, the queen, sits at his side, posture perfect, smile just wide enough to be polite but not so wide that anyone might think she's happy. And then there's the unspoken truth, the woman at the far edge of the hall, draped in a gown the color of crushed cherries, her gaze fixed on the king just a little too long. No one introduces her to you, but you don't need an introduction. This is the mistress. The air around her seems to shimmer with the kind of confidence you can't fake. In this court, mistresses are not just whispered about in corners. They're a fixture of royal life. It might shock you, but historians still argue whether kings truly loved these women or whether they were simply another extension of political strategy. The first recorded official mistress in European courts was almost a public appointment, complete with an allowance, a suite of rooms, and influence over decisions that could affect thousands. There's a strange duality in this world. By day, kings address ministers and ambassadors. By night, they host quieter gatherings in richly scented chambers where a whispered suggestion from a lover could shift the course of a treaty. It's not all candlelit romance, though. Sometimes the mistress's role was more like that of a diplomatic advisor, except she wore pearls instead of medals. And don't assume beauty was the whole story. A well-timed piece of flattery, a clever joke, or a shared enemy could be just as seductive as a flawless face. The palace corridors are filled with portraits of women whose eyes follow you as you pass, some of them immortalized, not because they were the king's great love, but because they were clever enough to keep him entertained and loyal enough not to embarrass him in public. Of course, for every glittering success story, there's the queen's silent endurance. She knows her husband's affections are split. She's expected to share him with the court's most talked-about woman and still appear serene during public ceremonies. Her own chambers may be just a few doors away, but emotionally they might as well be worlds apart. You pause under an arched window and watch a torchlit procession wind through the courtyard below. Somewhere in that line of carriages is a woman who is not the queen, but who will dine with the king tonight. You wonder how many royal decisions have been made not at council tables, but over soft laughter in candlelight. And you realize this is just the beginning of a long, winding story where love and politics are hopelessly tangled, and the walls of the palace have heard more than they will ever tell. You keep walking, your footsteps muffled by thick Persian carpets, and the palace begins to feel less like a home and more like a chessboard. Every person here is a piece, some with the power to move freely, others trapped in place until someone else decides their fate. The king and queen may look like they rule alone, but you can see now how many invisible threads pull at them from every direction. And one of the strongest threads often comes from a mistress's hand. Royal marriages were rarely built on love. They were political contracts in silk wrapping. A king might marry a foreign princess to secure a treaty or end a war. And yet, on the very night of the wedding banquet, whispers might already drift through the court about who would be his real companion. You'd think such arrangements would cause outrage, but in many cases everyone already knew the Queen's primary job wasn't to keep her husband's heart, it was to keep his bloodline going. Everything else? Fair game. Historians still argue whether kings were drawn to mistresses because of personal desire, or whether they sought them to gain influence in ways that the Queen, bound by diplomatic neutrality, could not. Sometimes having a mistress from a powerful family was a form of insurance, keeping certain nobles loyal, avoiding uprisings or smoothing over delicate negotiations. It was a kind of shadow diplomacy, conducted in whispered conversations after midnight, when the official court had gone to bed. And the queens? They learned to wear their composure like armor. Imagine sitting at a banquet table while your husband laughs too warmly at another woman's remark, and the entire court watches to see if your eyebrow twitches. The Queen's dignity became part of national stability. If she faltered, it could send the court into chaos. So she smiled. She lifted her jeweled goblet. She asked the other woman polite questions in a voice so calm it could chill boiling water. Not every queen succeeded at this act. Some bristled openly, their displeasure spilling into public scenes that fueled gossip for weeks. But others, those with the sharpest instincts, found ways to turn their husband's infidelity into leverage. If a mistress came from a noble faction the Queen distrusted, she might feign friendliness, drawing the woman close just enough to learn what the king was being told in private. You pause by a wall lined with portraits of past monarchs and their consorts. The queens stare back at you with the serene confidence of people who knew their image was as much a weapon as their words. And then you notice something, a subtle pattern. In many of the paintings, the queen's expression is controlled, regal. But the mistresses, when they appear in art at all, have a certain freedom in their gaze, as though they're aware that their power lies outside the official record. One story the guides never tell tourists. In the 16th century, a king once allowed his mistress to sit beside him at a council meeting, not as a decoration, but as an active participant. While ministers pretended not to notice, she quietly suggested changes to a trade agreement, changes that ended up saving the crown thousands in revenue. Officially, she wasn't even there. Unofficially, she had just outmaneuvered 3 seasoned diplomats. The corridors around you echo faintly with the hum of voices from a distant salon. Perhaps a chess game is underway, or a poet reciting lines for the king's amusement. But you know better now. Somewhere nearby, politics is unfolding in velvet and candlelight, and the rules aren't written down anywhere. They don't have to be. Everyone here understands them. You lean against a marble column and let your eyes drift over the room ahead, where the Queen sits beneath a canopy of state, the king by her side, and, standing just behind his shoulder, the mistress, close enough to whisper in his ear if she wished. It's a triangle as old as monarchy itself, and it's far more complicated than the portraits make it seem. You drift further down a long gallery, the air cooler here, as though the walls themselves are holding back centuries of breath and secrets. Outside the tall mullioned windows, night has deepened, and the gardens shimmer faintly under moonlight. Somewhere far below, the clip-clop of hooves echoes against cobblestone. It could be an ambassador arriving late, or perhaps someone far less official. In this palace, arrivals at odd hours are rarely for innocent reasons. Tonight you're here to meet the woman who made mistress not a shameful label, but an official title, a position recognized by the court, recorded in ledgers and even given a kind of ceremonial dignity. She wasn't the first royal lover in history, of course. Kings had been taking companions for as long as there had been thrones. But she was the first to transform the role from a scandal into a political instrument. Her name was whispered with both admiration and envy across Europe. Historians still argue whether her influence was purely the result of personal charm or whether she deliberately studied court politics the way a general studies maps before a campaign. What's certain is that she understood one thing better than most courtiers. Affection might fade, but utility could last a lifetime. When she arrived at court, she didn't simply become the king's distraction, she became his sounding board. Ministers began to notice that decisions debated in the council chamber were sometimes settled hours later in the king's private apartments. Over time, she was given her own apartments in the palace, lavish suites with embroidered hangings, a retinue of servants, and a personal steward to handle the stream of gifts and petitions sent her way. You wander into what might have been such an apartment, its parquet floors creaking softly under your steps. The scent of lavender and beeswax lingers faintly, as though the room is reluctant to give up the ghost of its former occupant. In the corner stands a small writing desk, delicate as spun sugar, where she might have penned letters to allies or subtly reminded a nobleman of a favour owed. The court adapted quickly. Foreign envoys began calling on her before approaching the king, slipping her carefully worded notes or ornate boxes filled with rare spices and silks. A smart envoy knew that a compliment to the mistress could speed along a stalled negotiation faster than any formal audience with the monarch. It wasn't just flattery, it was survival. And the queen? She learned to live with the arrangement. On paper, her position remained secure. No mistress could threaten her crown or her title, but privately she must have felt the sting. Imagine sitting through an evening of music, every note reminding you that the man beside you would not be in your bed that night. Some queens took comfort in their own networks of influence, family connections, trusted ladies-in-waiting, or quiet charitable works that won them loyalty among the people. Others simply buried the discomfort, presenting the same serene mask no matter the occasion. Yet not all mistresses had such smooth paths. Some overstepped, believing the king's affection made them untouchable. A misplaced word in the wrong ear could set the entire court against them. Our pioneering official mistress avoided that fate through a careful blend of discretion and visibility, never flaunting her role in ways that humiliated the queen, yet never hiding so much that she could be easily forgotten. It's here you start to see the strange balance this life required. Beauty might open the first door, but influence, wit, and timing kept it from slamming shut again. A single, well-timed suggestion could make her invaluable. A single, careless remark could end her entirely. Through the tall windows you catch sight of torchlight weaving through the garden paths, perhaps a private stroll between the king and his chosen companion. It's easy to imagine her, skirts brushing the gravel, head tilted just so, speaking in a tone meant only for him. The conversation could be about poetry, or about war, or, just as likely, both. You step into the Queen's apartments and the temperature drops half a degree, not because of the stone, but because composure has its own climate. Here, fabrics are quieter, colours more restrained. The candles burn evenly, no theatrical candelabras throwing wild shadows. This is where a nation's dignity is ironed smooth each morning and pinned in place with pearls. You've been floating through halls of golden indulgence. Now you're in the realm of duty, where every smile is measured to the millimetre. You notice how the Queen sits, spine long, shoulders soft, hands resting lightly as if she were born, cradling a kingdom. A lady-in-waiting reads from a slim book of devotions while another adjusts a spray of orange blossoms in a vase. You've learned the court's unofficial weather reports by now. The flowers are fresh, the voice is low, which means the king took supper elsewhere. The news is old, but it is always new. It arrives nightly like the moon. In this palace, a queen's first lesson is to master stillness. You think stillness is easy? Just don't move, right? Wrong. This is the art of breathing in public without ever inhaling scandal. When the king's gaze tilts toward the woman in crushed cherry silk, the queen's face remains so serene it could be stamped on coin. Historians still argue whether such poise was genuine piety, political training, or simply survival, learned the hard way from mothers and aunts who knew where the bruises of humiliation bloom. Whatever its source, it functions like armor, no chink, no crack, no visible seam. Mainstream fact time tucked neatly into the velvet cushions, royal consorts across Europe were expected to tolerate extramarital relationships as long as the succession remained clear, and the public ceremonies stayed polished. At the court of France, for instance, Mistresses en titre had acknowledged places, while queens were celebrated primarily for producing heirs and embodying virtue. This wasn't a glitch in royal marriage, it was a feature. The way beeswax polish is a feature of these floors. Try not to slip, by the way. The queen you're watching moves through her day like a clock whose chime is never quite allowed to ring. Morning prayers, audiences with petitioners, a charitable visit to a foundling hospital where she endows cradles and kisses foreheads, because a queen's mercy is as public as a parade. You walk with her carriage past the city gates and see people bowing not with trembling fear, but with a steady affection queens cultivated through patronage. She may not command the war horses or write secret notes at the cherry-coloured desk, but she wields the empire of example, bread to the poor, dowries to orphaned girls, a new fountain where the water's clean. This too is power, it simply travels without symbols. A quirky tidbit floats into the room like the scent of lavender from Section 3. Some courts favoured sleeve tokens, little knots of ribbon or embroidered favours that fans pinned to their garments. The Queen's colours would be worn at formal events, while clever courtiers hinted at allegiance to a mistress with subtler shades, slipping a sprig of her favourite herb into a hatband, say, or having a fan painted with a pattern only those in the know recognised. Fashion here is basically a group chat with better encryption. You settle near the window where the light falls like a faint benediction, and you watch her writing desk, smaller than the king's, more orderly than the mistress's. The Queen's letters don't trade in scandal, they trade in steadiness. She writes to her brother about a border skirmish and to a bishop about funding a school for midwives. She answers a duchess who fears her son has gambled away the family vineyards, and she drafts a carefully neutral note to the ambassador of a nation with whom her husband is very loudly pretending not to be angry. You see how a throne is maintained by 1,000 small stitches, most of them invisible from the parade route. Of course, serenity doesn't mean passivity. There's a rumour, palace halls do love a rumour, that the Queen has a private ledger kept in a plain binding. In it, she tallies the favours granted by the mistress's allies, which captain's commission was accelerated, which tax temporarily overlooked, which cousin received a conveniently timed loan. Not to expose anyone, at least not immediately, but to know the map. If you can't change the wind, you chart it. When the moment arrives, perhaps a drought forces the court to raise grain prices, or a minor rebellion demands a show of unity, she will place the ledger beside the king's breakfast and say in a voice calm enough to still a river that the crown might consider balancing its generosity, not a threat, a temperature check. Do queens feel jealousy? You aren't naive. They do. They just aren't allowed to demonstrate it, at least not with the theatrical flair of smashed porcelain. The Queen's version looks like a scheduling conflict. The evening the mistress planned to sponsor a poetry reading, the Queen hosts a charity concert featuring the court's most beloved singer. Guess which event the king happens to attend after the council session runs long. He's a creature of habit and optics. The Queen knows both intimately. You don't need a dagger when you've got the calendar. You stroll into the small chapel where the air tastes of candle smoke and frankincense. The Queen kneels, and you see how faith sits on her like a cloak, not necessarily heavy, but certainly layered. Sermons regularly rail against adultery, and yet you, me, and the chaplain all know which doors the king walks through after Vespers. The church's stance, at least in practice, often bent where crowns pressed down, and yet in the same breath preachers praised the Queen's patience as a mirror of divine endurance. Convenient theology, you murmur, and the saint in the window seems to agree. Here's another mainstream anchor to keep our ship steady. Queens in many courts retained separate households, budgets, and legal identities, which gave them latitude to act, founding hospitals, patronizing artists, maintaining diplomatic correspondences, independent of their husband's nightly itinerary. That independence was both a salve and a sword. If the mistress pushed the crown's favour too far, the queen might quietly redirect patronage to rival families, creating a gentle countercurrent the king could feel, even if he refused to name it. Historians still argue whether such corrections were orchestrated by the queens themselves or by savvy chamberlains reading the wind and protecting the realm's balance. Either way, the outcome looked the same, a subtle righting of the ship. Sometimes, though, the mask slips, not in public, never, but in the dressing room between the last pearl being clasped and the first step into the corridor. A sigh too deep for prayer. A hand that lingers a heartbeat too long on the back of a chair. You catch it once as the queen considers a new portrait. The painter suggests a softer smile. She declines. "Let it be accurate," she whispers. It is the bravest sentence you hear all day. At supper, protocol arranges the table like a battlefield mapped in cutlery. The queen sits in state, the king beside her, the favoured lady positioned where conversation can glance like sunlight without burning. You watch the queen ask for a dish she doesn't much like, merely to pass it to a dowager countess whose son needs a nudge toward promotion, generosity as networking, graciousness as policy. You also watch the queen thank the mistress for patronizing the orphanage embroidery guild, a courtesy that reads as praise while quietly confining her rival's influence to charitable outlets. Polite, pretty, and very bounded, like hedges trimmed into swans. You remember the crushed cherry gown from earlier and the lavender note from section 3, and you realize the queen remembers them too. She keeps a mental herbarium of details, fabrics, phrases, the way the king's laugh slides upward when he lies. She can't steer every tide, but she can place stones. One of them is the heir, her most irrefutable argument. The baby's cradle sits within sight of the royal bed in her apartments, strings of tiny coral charms against the evil eye dangling above. Quirky tidbit number 2. Coral was a widely favoured protective amulet in early modern Europe, not just for fishermen, apparently for kings who fish for excuses too. When the king visits the nursery, his face softens, the rooms return to their rightful centre of gravity, and for a minute the palace feels like a home instead of a diplomatic pressure cooker. Do queens ever make alliances with their rivals? You'll see more of that later, but a seed is sown here. The queen knows isolation is a slow poison. She gathers a circle of clever women, cousins, ladies, even a widow with a wickedly sharp Latin, and they make a salon that speaks softly and carries excellent memory. Stories that arrive from the mistresses' soirees drift here and are filed under useful if needed. No vengeance yet, just housekeeping. As the evening thins, you walk with the queen to the balcony. The city below twinkles like a spilled basket of garnets. A night watchman sings a warning against fire. Somewhere, a lute practices a scale it will never quite master. The queen stands very still. You expect a tear. Instead, you get a smile, not frozen, not false, but deliberate. It's the expression of someone who has chosen where to place her weight so that the floor will hold. It will hold tonight. It will hold tomorrow. It will hold until the ledger fills, the air strengthens, or history shifts, whichever arrives first. There's a softness in her voice as she turns to go, and you recognize it, the same softness you felt when the fan's hum in section 1 settled the room. Composure isn't cold, it's curated warmth, turned toward the world at a measured angle. She doesn't need the king's every glance to know her value. She needs the realm intact, the cradle rocking, the chapel candles burning exactly down to the brass. In that balance, she is sovereign. You follow her back inside, the door closing with a whisper. Behind the whisper, the palace resumes its tireless conversation. Silk against stone, rumour against silence, lavender against beeswax. Tomorrow will bring another banquet, another ribbon, another carefully arranged seating chart. The Queen will sit where she always sits. And the realm, for one more day, will believe in the kind of grace that looks effortless, only because it costs everything. The next corridor you enter hums differently, less like the quiet heartbeat of the Queen's realm, and more like the sharp whisper of messages folded into fans. This is where foreign envoys sometimes linger, their eyes pretending to study the tapestries while they wait for an introduction to someone who is not the Queen. Tonight, the air here smells faintly of musk and warmed wine, the perfume of diplomacy done after hours. A small group of gentlemen, boots polished, lace cuffs just so, stand in a loose half-circle, speaking French in voices low enough that the servants must pretend not to hear. You catch snippets, a border dispute, a grain shortage, and, woven between, the name of a certain lady who, it seems, can help smooth the matter, if approached with the proper courtesies. Mistresses, you've learned, weren't just private amusements. They could be as deliberate a political tool as a royal marriage itself. Historians still argue whether kings consciously used them this way, or whether the habit of sharing confidences with a lover simply made it inevitable. Either way, these women often became the unofficial ambassadors of the bedchamber, delivering messages that would have been too risky to send through official channels. It's a strange sort of irony. The Queen, bound by ceremony, couldn't meddle in certain affairs without causing offence, but the mistress, technically unofficial in all things, could float between factions like smoke, leaving no trace but the faint scent of her presence. One evening, she might be charming the representative of a neighbouring kingdom. The next, she's leaning over the king's shoulder at cards, murmuring the envoy's private hopes for the treaty. You follow one such envoy now, a Spaniard whose boots squeak faintly on the polished floor. He enters a salon glowing with candlelight, where the mistress sits on a low settee upholstered in deep green velvet. Her gown is the colour of fresh cream, her jewels catching the light in little ripples. She rises, not too quickly, not too slowly, and greets him as though they've been old friends, separated only by distance, never by politics. The conversation begins with weather, as these things often do, but soon her questions start to unspool the thread he's holding. Does the king truly intend to send troops to that border? And if not, what might persuade him otherwise? She doesn't press, she lets silence do some of the work. It's a skill worth noting. In this court, pauses are currency, and she's rich in them. The mainstream fact here is surprisingly blunt. In several European courts, mistresses were acknowledged conduits for diplomacy. Louis XV's maîtresse en titre, Madame de Pompadour, famously influenced alliances during the 7 Years' War, in part by entertaining diplomats in informal settings where rigid protocol would have shut down conversation. It's not exactly the method taught in political theory, but it was effective enough to reshape borders. Of course, the arrangement wasn't without risk. The mistress who played politics too boldly could find herself accused of treachery, her every word twisted into a plot. That's why the most successful operated with the precision of a jeweler cutting diamonds. One wrong angle, and the whole piece cracked. There's a quirky little tradition you overhear tonight, a token exchange in which an envoy might present the mistress with a piece of lace from his homeland, ostensibly as a gift for her beauty, but actually as a signal that he seeks a private audience on state matters. The gift is displayed for a day or two, long enough for the king to notice, if he's meant to, and then it vanishes, either accepted or politely refused. You wonder how many treaties have been born in that unspoken exchange, somewhere between the lace and the disappearance of it. The Queen, of course, is not blind to any of this. She may not be present, but her informants are, and she knows the fine line between political utility and personal threat. If a mistress begins to draw too much favour from foreign courts, the Queen can subtly lean on her own contacts to counterbalance, perhaps hosting a reception for the same envoy where the king is conspicuously absent, but the Queen's hospitality is flawless. Nothing undermines a rival's influence like showing that you, too, can command the room without even needing the king's hand at your elbow. Meanwhile, in this green velvet salon, the conversation has shifted to music. A harpsichord is rolled forward, and the mistress plays a light, lilting air. The envoy hums along in a way that suggests either genuine pleasure or well-practiced flattery, it's hard to tell which, and in this place it hardly matters. The music fills the room, but you can't help feeling the real performance is the subtle shaping of alliances, all under the cover of melody. By the time the envoy leaves, his boots squeak just the same as when he arrived, but something in his manner has changed. Perhaps a small promise has been made, or perhaps only a seed planted. In court politics, both can be equally powerful. As the door closes behind him, the mistress pours herself a glass of spiced wine. She doesn't smile exactly, but her eyes gleam. You get the feeling she's just moved a piece across the board that the Queen will notice tomorrow. And the King? He'll think it was his idea all along. You leave the scent of spiced wine behind and find yourself moving toward the eastern wing of the palace, where the air feels heavier, almost perfumed with expectation. This is where the private suites of the maîtresse en titre, or her equivalent in other courts, are usually located. Tonight, the place feels like a stage waiting for the curtain to rise, and the woman at its center has mastered the art of making every entrance feel like an opening night. The mistress's life might seem like a dream of silks and banquets, but you quickly realize it's a careful performance, down to the tilt of her chin when she greets a servant, and the measured warmth in her voice when speaking to a nobleman's wife. Her days are structured as tightly as the Queen's, but with a very different objective. The Queen's duty is to embody stability. The mistress's is to embody allure without ever making it look like work. You're ushered into her private chambers, where the light is softer than in the Queen's rooms. Here, thick carpets swallow every footstep, and gilded mirrors multiply the flicker of candle flames until the space feels almost infinite. On a low table rests a tray of sugared fruits and delicate porcelain cups filled with chocolate, an indulgence imported at great expense. Historians still argue whether such luxury was a perk of her role or a necessity. After all, a mistress in this position is constantly hosting the king, even when no banquet is scheduled. She must always have something rare to offer: a book imported from Italy, a melody newly arrived from Vienna, a witty remark perfectly timed to lift the king's mood after a bruising council session. It's a performance of intimacy, but one in which the audience is also the star. The mainstream fact here is that many royal mistresses received official allowances, sometimes larger than what was given to certain princes, specifically to maintain this standard of living. The expense wasn't just for vanity, it was political theatre. When the king visited her apartments, he wasn't simply visiting a lover, he was stepping into a world tailored to remind him of his own magnificence. You watch her at her dressing table, where a lady's maid pins pearls into her hair with the precision of a jeweler setting gemstones. Each pearl is slightly different, and she turns her head just enough to catch the candlelight on them, as though she's practiced this exact movement 100 times. Beside her sits a small casket containing letters tied with ribbon, not all from the king. Some are notes from influential courtiers who know that her smile can carry their request to the monarch's ear faster than any petition delivered to the council chamber. A quirky tidbit emerges as you study her table. Nestled between the powder box and the rouge pot is a small silver vial of perfume infused with ambergris. Sourced from the digestive tracts of whales and worth more than gold, it's said to make a scent last all day. In court gossip, the vial itself becomes a talking point. How did she get it? Who gave it? And what does it mean that she wears it only when the king is due to visit? The king arrives unannounced, but she's ready, as she always is. The first few minutes are spent on light talk, a shared jest about a court musician's disastrous attempt at dancing, or a sly comment about a nobleman's overstuffed doublet. Beneath the laughter you can feel the air hum with a different kind of conversation. How much of his mood tonight will she need to manage? Will she dare to suggest that envoy's request he dismissed yesterday? Mistresses in this position live in a constant balancing act, Push too hard on politics and she risks being labelled meddlesome. Avoid it entirely and she loses one of her most valuable currencies, access to the king's unguarded ear. Historians still debate whether the most successful mistresses truly influenced statecraft, or whether kings used them as a convenient scapegoat for unpopular decisions. Either way, the perception of influence was enough to draw both gifts and enemies to her door. When the king finally leaves, she doesn't relax. She shifts. The performance for him is over, but now comes the equally delicate performance for the court. Servants arrive to clear the chocolate cups, carrying with them bits of overheard conversation they will inevitably trade with others. She listens to their chatter with a half-smile, tucking away the useful scraps like a magpie. Before the night ends, she walks alone into a small adjoining room. Here, the glamour fades just enough for you to see the steel beneath. The ledgers are here, careful lists of who sent gifts, who visited, who might be falling out of favour. The mistress may not wear a crown, but she manages her own kind of kingdom, one made of favours, smiles, and the occasional well-timed whisper. You realise now that being kept is less about luxury and more about control over one's image, one's access, and, perhaps most dangerously, one's own feelings. The Queen's armour is dignity, the mistress's is charm, and both require constant repair. You return to the long gallery where portraits do their best to pretend they're not eavesdropping. Beauty stares down from every frame, rosebud lips, swan necks, eyelashes so long they could sweep a hearth. But after a few minutes you notice something all the rouge in Europe can't disguise. The painted women who lasted, who mattered, have the tiniest crinkle at the corner of the eye. Not age, calculation. The look of someone who knows that loveliness is an opening bid, not the whole game. Tonight you trail the mistress with the ambergris vial from section 6, as she drifts not toward the king's apartments, but to a different battlefield, the salon. It's held in a room where the walls are papered with chinoiserie, birds flitting among painted tea blossoms like they own the lease. A cluster of courtiers warms around a fire, and the buzz here is quicksilver, anecdotes, epigrams, little intellectual daredevils on the trapeze. She enters, and the conversation lifts a half-inch, as though the floor remembered to breathe. No crushed cherry drama tonight. She wears a gown the colour of rain over slate, quite enough to listen in. Here the currency isn't cheekbones, it's timing. A duke floats a joke about the treasury. She catches it mid-air, turns it gently, and lands it in a way that lets everyone laugh and remember who proposed the grain levy last spring. The finance minister flushes, then nods. She's made him the butt of the joke and protected him in the same sentence. That's not flirting, that's fencing with a velvet blade. Mainstream fact to hang your hat on. At multiple early modern courts, especially in France and England, the enduring power of maîtresses en titre and royal favourites rested not on static beauty but on their role as cultural and political nodes, hosting salons, commissioning art, placing clients in offices, and acting as patrons to scientists, playwrights, and architects. A clever patronage web outlived a season's fashion. The woman who could make and unmake reputations with a nod tended to stay. Think less boudoir and more board of directors in brocade. Wit isn't just sparkle, it's a sorting mechanism. Watch her tell a small story about a broken carriage wheel just outside the city. Harmless, except the road in question is maintained by a marquis whose loyalties wobble with his axles. Everyone laughs, the marquis the loudest, and suddenly a repair crew appears in your imagination at dawn, hammering not only wood, but allegiance. Your first light joke of the night floats in behind theirs. If potholes could vote, this administration would be terrified, and you get a few smothered grins. Even the footman coughs in a miraculously timed way. Historians still argue whether these salons truly redirected policy or merely massaged the egos of men who'd already decided. You, standing in a corner pretending to examine porcelain, suspect the answer is yes. Not because she dictates statutes, but because she shapes which ideas feel inevitable. If a tax sounds elegant enough at midnight, it looks sensible by noon. If a general's name earns 3 raised eyebrows in a single evening, The king feels suddenly clever, declining his request at council. You slip with her into a smaller antechamber where the real work happens. Alliances, not grand oaths, quiet ones. A young countess with excellent Latin, and a brother who's terrible with dice, a bishop who writes poetry no one should be allowed to read, a widow with shipping interests and the serene ruthlessness of a chess clock. The mistress doesn't beg favours, she trades them like rare coins, always keeping one shinier than the other side expects. Remember the Queen's ledger in section 4? The mistress keeps something similar, but hers records gratitude with asterisks and grudges with neat little skulls. Kidding, probably. You do spot a flourish or two. A quirky tidbit glints on the table, a miniature conversation fan, its slats painted with tiny scenes and discreet phrases. Flip one way and it reads, "Oui, peut-être." Flip another, and "Ce soir n'est pas prudent." Fan language was a flirt's toolkit, sure, but in practice it served as shorthand for logistics. When the mistress tilts the fan 3 slats left during a card game, a secretary across the room knows to delay tomorrow's hunting party. 2 slats, right? The Neapolitan singer gets bumped to the second set. Imagine if modern meetings could be rescheduled with a breeze. Whole productivity apps would burst into tears. Beauty fades. The old proverb nags. But resourcefulness moisturizes. Watch how she handles the painter commissioned for her new portrait. He suggests a low neckline, she suggests a book. "Open or closed?" he asks. "Half open," she says, and the room chuckles. The point isn't the joke, though it's good, it's the signal. This portrait will carry the message that she reads, thinks, and chooses. The king can hang 10 canvases of her shoulders, but the one with the book will be the one ambassadors remember. You catch a whiff of lavender, that callback from section 3, and realize it's drifting in from the corridor, which means someone brings news. A lady-in-waiting arrives with a face so neutral you suspect professional training. There's talk of a cavalry appointment going to the rival faction. No panic. The mistress's reply is a gentle, "How fortunate?" which means absolutely not. She will not storm the council. She will invite the king to a stroll among the orange trees after supper, where the air is sweet and decisions grow malleable. She will tell a story about a brave captain, the candidate she favours, who once rescued a child from a flooded mill stream, and the king, who adores tales of sudden heroics, will feel the appointment correcting itself as if by breeze. She won't even say the rival's name. She doesn't have to. Mainstream fact the second. Patronage networks in courts from Madrid to Versailles functioned like social credit systems. Dancers became spies, secretaries became ministers, cousins became comptrollers, based less on exams and more on who could assemble and maintain a reliable web. A royal favourite who placed the right people could stabilise a reign. Place the wrong ones, and you got waste, rebellion, or the kind of pamphlets that sell like hotcakes. Hotcakes, unlike pamphlets, are rarely seditious and less badly cooked. But raw cleverness isn't enough. It must be staged. So she curates her unroyal family, a famous wit whose jokes come pre-approved, to land near the king but never on him. A natural philosopher who can make lightning in a bottle. Safely, please. No singed wigs this time. A seamstress who can produce a ribbon in exactly the shade of the Queen's favourite charity, because someone remembers diplomacy. When the Queen notices, and she will, the ribbon says, "I know your causes, a skirmish avoided, a bridge strengthened." You remember the coral charms over the cradle and realise the mistress prefers a different talisman, plausible deniability. Your second light joke arrives courtesy of the kitchen. A page whispers that the almond custards have collapsed. As long as the alliance doesn't, the mistress says, we can forgive the almonds. You can feel 10 tensions unclench. Later, a steward will carry perfectly acceptable pears, and the evening will proceed as if custards were a myth invented by nervous chefs. Not all wit sparkles publicly. Some of it hides in letters. You watch her compose one now, ink pooling like midnight. The address is to a marchioness who's been cultivating piety as a hobby and influence as a vocation. The lines are warm but in the margins there's a single clue, a pressed sprig of rosemary. In the salon's private code, rosemary means remembrance, and also, conveniently, yes, I recall the favour I owe you, the return is en route. Historians still argue whether such codes were widespread or a later romantic gloss, but the existence of ciphers and symbols in aristocratic correspondence is plain enough. When everyone reads everyone's mail, meaning learns to wear disguises. Beauty launches a career, alliances renew the contract. Consider the aging favourite you glimpse by the window, silver at the temples, laughter still quick. 10 years ago she dazzled, now she orchestrates. She mentors a younger woman, coaching posture, trimming metaphors, warning against that one chamberlain whose compliments arrive like bills. Is this altruism? Strategy more likely? In this ecosystem, protégés become insulation. If the king's attention wanders, it wanders within a circle she drew. Look closely and you see the salon's chairs arranged as if casually, yet the two most promising minds sit where the king will pause. That's interior decorating as national policy. Quirky tidbit number 2, you're collecting them like ribbon tokens. The mistress's household keeps a blue hour routine. For 1 hour after dusk, candles are limited, windows unlatched, and music soft, supposedly to rest the eyes. In practice, it encourages low conversation and listening. Servants learn to walk lighter. Courtiers sense they are heard. You can practically see information float in like moths. If gossip is oxygen here, the blue hour is a lung. And the risks? They accumulate like dust on a gilded frame. One misread joke, one ally promoted who turns out to be spectacularly bad at not embezzling, one portrait too grand unveiled the week the capital faces a bread riot. Any of these can tip favour into fury. The smart favourite keeps a weather eye on the street. She funds a bakery in a rough quarter under the Queen's charity banner, sends excess candles to a parish with a burnt roof, and makes sure musicians play an old soldier's tune when the guard changes. Sentiment, directed correctly, is policy with a heartbeat. You step out with her onto a covered loggia. Night tastes like orange peel and cool stone. Below, the gardens fold toward the dark like theatre curtains after the bows. She's quiet, finally. In the stillness you hear the softest rustle, the turning of a page in that mental ledger she carries, the one that lists not prettiness but proofs, problem solved, tempers cooled, embarrassments preempted. Beauty got her the key, wit keeps the hinges oiled. Your last light joke slides in on the breeze. You consider how exhausting it would be to be this poised for more than, say, 11 minutes. She's been doing it for years. If you tried, you'd need a nap, a snack, and possibly a supportive corset for your soul. She smiles as if she heard you, which is very unfair of her, but also on brand. Back inside, a harpsichord begins a courante. The king is due any moment, drawn by habit and by the easy oxygen of being admired without question. He will find a room that flatters him without fawning, ideas arranged like fruit where he can taste them and declare them delicious, and a companion who seems to anticipate which topic will restore his humour and which will wait until morning. Historians still argue whether she leads or follows in these dances. Watching her now, you suspect she does both, forward on the downbeat, back on the up, never stepping on the royal toes, guiding him where he meant to go all along, or where he will later remember meaning to go. And when someday a newer face arrives, loveliness bright as noon, she will not sprint for the mirror. She will send flowers to the Queen's charity, schedule a poetry reading with verses the king learned as a boy, and place 3 chairs where the light is forgiving. She knows what beauty can't do and what intelligence must. The game is long, the salon is open, the fan tilts left. The palace seems quieter tonight, though you suspect that's just the surface. This kind of quiet often hides storms, not the kind with lightning, but the kind with perfectly aimed whispers. Somewhere behind a carved walnut door, the queen is choosing her words with surgical care. You find her in a smaller reception room, one you've never noticed before. The walls are lined with pale blue damask, and the air smells faintly of quince jam from the kitchens below. She's seated in a high-backed chair, a lady-in-waiting at her elbow, her fingers idly smoothing the edge of an embroidered handkerchief. The Queen's composure is intact, but you've been here long enough to know when stillness is an act of loading a bowstring. Tonight, she is not simply enduring the presence of her husband's mistress, she is preparing to push back. Queens have limited tools for this. They cannot storm into the king's rooms with accusations. That would be beneath the dignity of the crown and, more importantly, politically foolish. But they can make the rival's position uncomfortable. Sometimes this is done subtly, a pointed remark in public, a frostier reception at court gatherings. Other times, the pushback comes wrapped in silk and sugar. Historians still argue whether such countermeasures were planned by the queens themselves or orchestrated by their loyal advisers. Either way, the results could be devastating. One well-placed rumor about a mistress's family debt, for example, might suddenly make her seem like a liability rather than an asset. The king could still adore her company, but the ministers might begin to hint that her influence is becoming politically inconvenient. The mainstream fact here is that queens in several European courts had their own shadow networks, often just as sophisticated as the mistresses. Ladies-in-waiting, trusted confessors, foreign relatives, each could act as a line of communication, a funnel for information, or a shield when gossip threatened to splash too close to the throne. A quirky tidbit drifts in from an earlier century. In some courts, the queen would deliberately lend an item of her clothing to a mistress, perhaps a shawl or a necklace, to be worn at a public event. To the casual observer, this might look like a gesture of friendship, but in certain circles it could also be read as a claim of dominance, a reminder that the queen's position is the source of the rival's borrowed glitter. Tonight, the queen's chosen tactic is neither outright hostility nor false warmth, it's proximity. She's arranged for the mistress to be seated beside her at supper. This might seem like generosity, but in truth, it's a high-wire act. In such a place of honor, the mistress will be under constant scrutiny. Every sip of wine, every turn of phrase, every laugh that lingers too long at the king's words will be noted by the watching courtiers. You watch the supper unfold. The table gleams with silver chargers, the dishes arriving in an orderly procession, pike in cream sauce, roast partridge, glazed quince. The queen asks the mistress polite questions, her voice just warm enough to make refusing an answer impossible. When the mistress responds, the queen's smile never falters, but her eyes flick, almost imperceptibly, to the faces of nearby guests, marking their reactions, storing them away. At one point, the king mentions a planned hunting trip. The mistress leans in to suggest a location. The queen tilts her head and softly recalls that the last time the king hunted there, the weather ruined the outing. A murmur of agreement runs down the table. The idea is gently undercut without a single sharp word. It's like watching two dancers on the same floor, each trying to lead without stepping on the other's toes. The mistress leans on charm, the queen on the weight of tradition. One glitters, the other anchors. Later, in the withdrawing room, the queen plays the next move in her game. She summons a singer, a young woman with an angelic voice, to perform a ballad the king loved in his youth. As the notes float into the air, you can see the king's expression soften with nostalgia. The mistress smiles, but she wasn't the one who arranged it. She knows it. The queen knows she knows it. Historians still debate whether such moments ever won anything tangible, but they didn't have to win outright. They just had to remind the court and the king that the queen could still command a certain kind of magic, one the mistress couldn't always touch. As the night winds down, the queen dismisses her ladies and steps into the corridor. You follow at a respectful distance, catching just the faintest trace of her perfume. She hasn't shouted, she hasn't schemed openly, and yet you know the balance of the court has shifted a fraction in her favor. In this place, that's enough to keep her footing. Tomorrow the mistress will find a new way to reclaim her ground, but tonight the queen sleeps knowing she hasn't simply endured, she's acted. And in this palace, that is a victory all its own. By the next afternoon, the storm clouds that had been politely circling the palace finally begin to break, not in thunder, but in gold. You're summoned to the outer courtyard, where a procession of carts and footmen has formed, all of them laden with gifts bound for the king's favourite. It's here you see one of the strangest engines of the royal world in motion, the mistress economy. Jewellery cases are stacked beside barrels of wine from distant vineyards. Bolts of velvet spill over the edges of crates, catching the light like water in motion. A lacquered chest from the east holds porcelain so thin it seems it could shatter if you breathe too hard. There's even a pair of snow-white hunting dogs leashed by a footman in livery so stiff it looks like he's been ironed. The mainstream fact is plain. Royal mistresses were often rewarded not just with personal gifts from the king, but with estates, titles, and incomes that could rival those of high-ranking nobles. Louis XIV's mistresses, for example, were granted entire chateaux. In England, royal favourites received country houses and pensions for life. These were not just tokens of affection. They were investments in loyalty, ensuring the mistress stayed content, influential, and, crucially, within reach. Of course, such generosity rippled outward. Jewellers, dressmakers, wigmakers, and perfumers built their fortunes on the patronage of a royal favourite. When a mistress wore a new style of gown, the court followed. When she switched perfumes, the market surged in that scent. In some cities, an entire district's economy could rise or fall based on the whims of one woman in the king's chambers. You follow the carts inside to her apartments, where the gifts are displayed before they're parcelled out. Not everything is for her alone. Some will be redistributed as political favours. A diamond bracelet might go to the wife of a powerful minister, a fine stallion to a general whose loyalty needs reinforcing. This redistribution isn't charity, it's strategy. Every gift passed along is another thread in her personal web of influence. A quirky tidbit appears in the form of a small golden snuff box with an enamel painting on the lid. It shows a pastoral scene, shepherds, sheep, and a remarkably plump little dog. The dog is an inside joke between her and the king, something only they understand. The value of the box isn't in its gold or artistry, but in the story it carries. In court, objects like this are as good as signatures. Anyone who sees it knows exactly where it came from. Historians still argue whether the lavish spending on mistresses strained royal treasuries or whether it was simply a drop in the ocean of court expenses. Either way, the optics could be dangerous. During times of famine or war, news of a mistress receiving a necklace worth a year's wages for a regiment could sour public opinion. Clever favourites anticipated this. They might make a show of donating part of their windfall to a hospital or sponsoring a church restoration, carefully ensuring the king got credit for his generosity. You watch her examine a ruby pendant, turning it slowly in the light. Without a word, she sets it aside in a small pile. Those are the pieces she'll keep for herself, the ones that can be worn in public without sparking too much chatter. The larger, showier items will be seen only once or twice, enough to establish their existence, before they're quietly gifted to someone whose loyalty is worth more than the jewels themselves. The king arrives midway through this sorting, and the atmosphere changes instantly. Servants stand straighter, the air feels warmer, and the mistress moves to greet him with a practiced balance of affection and deference. He laughs when he sees the hunting dogs and promises they'll be named for a pair of troublesome ministers. The joke lands well. Everyone laughs just enough, no more, no less. You notice the Queen's absence. She's not here to see the procession of wealth, and perhaps that's deliberate. Still, you suspect the news will reach her before the hour is out. She will know who received what, and which gifts were destined for redistribution. The Queen's ledger will gain a few new entries, while the mistress's mental map of obligations will grow even denser. When the king leaves, the mistress calls for wine and has the servants carry the dogs to the garden. You follow her as she steps into the sunlight, her skirts whispering against the gravel. The dogs bound ahead, oblivious to the political machinery their arrival has just set in motion. Here, in the open air, she lets the performance drop for a moment. She kneels to scratch the dog's ears, her smile uncalculated. But even in this quiet, you know she's thinking 3 steps ahead. of which noble will be charmed by which gift, of which ally might need a little more silk or silver to keep them steady, and of how the next shipment might tilt the court's balance once again. In this palace, generosity isn't about giving, it's about binding. And no one binds quite like the king's favourite. Night falls and the palace changes costume before anyone even lifts a mask. You can feel it in the corridors, torches trimmed lower, laughter pitched softer, a rustle of silk that sounds like people pretending not to run. You follow the current toward the great ballroom, where a masquerade is already blooming. Petals of colour, petals of noise, petals of secrets curled tight and fragrant. It smells faintly of orange peel, beeswax, and the barest echo of ambergris from Section 6, as if someone bottled intrigue and spritzed it over the crowd. At the door, an usher offers you a half-mask, black satin tied with ribbons. You fasten it, and the world blurs into something that feels like permission. Suddenly rank softens. A marquis becomes a shepherd from a pastoral opera. A bishop becomes a Pierrot with very expressive eyebrows. The king becomes a domino in plain black, which is roughly the historical equivalent of trying to be low-key in a crown. The queen arrives later unmasked. She doesn't need camouflage. She has composure, see Section 4. And her entrance steadies the room like a metronome. Mainstream fact to anchor your steps. From Venice to Versailles, masquerades were a staple of 17th, 18th century court life. In Venice, carnival masks levelled the street, letting nobles and fishmongers pass each other without formal mention. At Versailles and in London's pleasure gardens, masked balls gave elites a sanctioned space to flirt, gossip, and occasionally negotiate politics with plausible deniability. The dance figures, the minuet's bows, the contradance's crossings, created little corridors of privacy inside a crowd. If you've ever tried to have a private conversation at a loud party and succeeded, congratulations. You understand the minuet. A harpsichord flickers the first notes of a gavotte, and bodies begin to braid. You catch sight of crushed cherry silk, hello again, Section 1, gliding past a fan, painted with 3 discrete phrases, Section 7. The mistress isn't hiding, she's hiding in plain sight, which is better. She tips the fan left, possibly ce soir n'est pas prudent, and a secretary across the room redirects a conversation toward the punch bowl. One gesture, and a minister is spared a disastrous promise made under too much champagne. Somewhere a ledger, perhaps the Queen's, will get a small, satisfied tick mark. Masks are supposed to democratize the room, but everyone still reads the code: posture, gloves, perfume, the angle of a curtsy. Quirky tidbit, beauty patches, tiny silk or velvet mouches, dot several faces, moons and hearts near lips and temples. In certain courts they doubled as flirtation grammar. A patch near the right eye hinted at passion, near the corner of the mouth suggested playfulness, and a patch near the cheekbone said, in essence, promotion's welcome. You note one daring soul with a star patch close to the temple, which probably means ambition or I ran out of sensible places. Historians still argue whether masquerades truly freed speech, or simply added a fashionable veil to the same old hierarchies. Did masks let women and lower-ranking men speak more boldly, or did the powerful just enjoy cosplay while keeping the reins hidden in their sleeves? You watch a domino in plain black, likely the king, pause by a shepherdess whose crook is suspiciously gilded. They exchange the kind of quick, bright glances that move regiments and reform tax codes, and you think, maybe it's both. Liberation on a leash, you're drawn into a contredanse, stepping forward, back, turning to meet a new partner as your old one spins away. The figure is called La Chaîne Anglaise, and for 30 seconds you exist inside a whispering corridor. Tomorrow's hunting party, your partner murmurs, her mask a gilt half-moon, must not pass the South Bridge. Flooding. Soldiers posted there? She doesn't say. You don't ask. The dance turns you apart, then brings you together again for the punchline. Send pairs. Peers, you recall from Section 7, are how the kitchen apologizes when custards collapse. Pairs are also how messages travel via harmless gifts. You nod like someone who appreciates fruit. Across the floor, the queen converses with a harlequin in blue and white diamonds. He bows low, and she smiles with that measured warmth that can rebalance a room without rattling a single glass. If she is wary of the masquerade's loosened tongues, she doesn't show it. Instead, she deploys memory the way the mistress deploys charm. She recalls a veteran's daughter who needs a dowry, mentions it to a dowager in a mask of black lace, and by the time the set ends, the girl's future is braided into the night's festivities like a hidden ribbon. Your first light joke of the evening presents itself as a gentleman whose mask is so elaborate he keeps bumping into pillars. Social climbing, you whisper to no one, in its final form. He straightens, pretends the pillar is at fault, and proceeds to flatter it with a bow. The pillar accepts. Not everything is velvet. Masquerades can cut. Pamphleteers adore them. A single, reckless whisper can be printed by morning with woodcuts of masked sinners and shocked saints. That's why the palace keeps the blue hour, Section 7 rule even here. Musicians drop to softer sets, windows crack open, and the mood cools just enough to discourage confessions that turn into pamphlets by dawn. Even libertinism needs a thermostat. You slip into the card room where conversation sounds like wind in silk. A lady in a domino deals faro with the serene efficiency of a mathematician who's forgiven numbers for being predictable. The mistress perches at her left, a position that allows both oversight and exit. She wins modestly, loses elegantly, and in between arranges a seat at the council table for a cousin of a cousin, provided someone's debts are settled and someone else's poetry never sees daylight. She signs nothing. The fan says everything. Mainstream anchor number 2. In many courts, the language of the fan and language of the glove were more etiquette than cryptography, but they served a practical purpose. A dropped glove could signal request. A glove turned inside out warned of danger, and a fan snapped shut might end a conversation without ending a friendship. When surveillance is social, ears in alcoves, eyes behind tapestry slits, manners evolve into tools. Dance again. This time, a minuet, the steps traced like cursive on the floor. You partner with a Pierrot whose melancholy seems theatrical until he leans closer and whispers that the South Bridge truly is flooded and the King's planned excursion will embarrass a certain engineer. Could the excursion be rerouted, you ask? To the northwards, he says, where the roads are excellent, and the view reminds His Majesty of his first hunt with his father. Nostalgia again, the Queen's weapon in Section 8, now wielded by a masked friend. You suspect the mistress and the Queen are playing, if not the same tune, then at least the same key signature. Across the hall, laughter spikes and falls. A satyr mask, always a risk, tries a joke about taxes, trips over the punchline, and nearly into the punch. Your second light joke breezes in. If wine were policy, half the kingdom would be solvent. The satyr writes himself and promises reform, beginning with another ladleful. A small procession appears. 2 snow-white hunting dogs, Section 9, led by a page in green. The room ripples with recognition and a little mischief. Someone has brought the ministers on leashes bit to life. The King's domino tilts in amusement. The Queen's eyes glimmer. The mistress's fan ticks a single notch. Careful. Humour that bites too cleanly can leave marks. The page bows, the dogs are admired, and they are led out before satire graduates to scandal. You wander the edge of the hall and find a side gallery where the music muffles into velvet. Here, portraits watch through slitted eyes, and a handful of guests speak in threads. A harlequin admits, sotto voce, that a convoy of grain is delayed. A Colombina counters that the city's guilds have agreed to extend credit if the crown publicly thanks them. In the square? Harlequin asks. On the balcony, Colombina replies. It will look theatrical. It will be policy. Historians still argue whether these masked interludes were mere theatre or genuine workshops of governance. You, pressed into a niche, smelling faintly of lavender, Section 3, suspect they were both. Stagecraft that steadied an economy. Quirky tidbit number 2 flits by on a whisper. Someone swears the talking statue in the city, one of those ancient pedestals where anonymous satire is pinned at dawn, received a sonnet today praising the Queen's patience and comparing the mistress to a north wind that freshens the sails. Flattery smuggled as civic poetry, you'd roll your eyes if it weren't so effective. By morning, the market women will be quoting it between weighing cabbages. Culture is a courier with very fast feet, more dancing. The orchestra shifts to a country dance imported from England, and the floor fills with bright geometry. You trade partners like rumours, quickly, politely, with plausible deniability. A gentleman in a modest mask speaks of fortifying a riverbank. A lady with a star patch murmurs that a poet has written an ode so disastrous it might cause famine. You advise pairs again. Peers fix many things. Your third light joke sidles in. If bureaucracy danced half as neatly as this set, bridges would build themselves out of sheer embarrassment. Midnight nicks the candles shorter. A servant passes with fresh tapers. Another carries a tray of orange slices dusted with sugar. You catch the Queen accepting one, then offering another to the mistress, who accepts with a bow that holds exactly the right weight of respect, precisely the right centimetre of distance. For a breath, the two women, Ledger and Fan, share a single square of quiet. Not friendship, not truce. Recognition. The kingdom sleeps better when both are steady. The king, still a shadow in black, drifts near a window cracked open to the night. Outside, the gardens fold themselves into secrecy. He says something you can't hear. The mistress answers with a tilt of the fan. The Queen speaks last, and whatever she says lands like a pin set gently into silk. Tomorrow, the hunting party will go north. The papers will praise prudence. The engineer will live to fortify another bridge, ideally one with less water on the wrong side. As guests begin to unmask, the room returns to its usual hierarchy with a sigh, like stays being loosened. Some faces surprise no one, others recalibrate alliances. That witty domino was the widow with ships, that dashing shepherd worked for the treasury, that silent Pierrot was the only man brave enough not to talk. You untie your ribbons and feel your own face return, useful, but not necessarily freer. When the last violin fades, you step into the corridor. The air is cooler, the stones familiar underfoot. From a nearby chamber comes the soft shuffle of ledgers. Section 4, the put-away clink of a snuff-box lid. Section 9, the barely-there sigh of a woman removing pearls. Section 6, hidden in plain sight, the night has arranged tomorrow. No treaties signed, no decrees stamped, and yet the city will wake to a plan that feels inevitable. The mark of decisions made well. You pass a mirror and catch yourself half smiling. It's the masquerade's last trick. The mask didn't hide you. It showed you how much of you is costume already. You straighten, breathe, and head for the staircase, where a footman snores upright like a dedicated statue. You consider pinning a poem to him and decide he's suffered enough. Down the hall, a door closes softly. The night keeps its secrets. The palace, practiced as ever, keeps moving. By morning, the ballroom has been stripped of its magic. The masks are gone, the musicians paid, the last of the orange peel swept away. But the undercurrent from last night's masquerade lingers. Small shifts in mood, subtle rearrangements of favour. And today those currents swirl toward a more dangerous subject, heirs. You find yourself in the council gallery where portraits of past monarchs glare down as if daring the living to measure up. The air here smells faintly of beeswax and old parchment. Courtiers pace in twos and threes, their whispers tighter than usual. The topic isn't war or trade, it's the dangerous pregnancy question. Mainstream fact throughout European history, illegitimate children of kings posed real political risks. A beloved mistress bearing a son could trigger factional scheming, especially if the legitimate heir was young, frail, or, worse, non-existent. Even when succession laws clearly barred illegitimate offspring, the mere existence of a rival bloodline could cause instability. Louis XIV acknowledged several children by his mistresses, granting them titles. In England, Charles the Stain famously fathered many, but left the crown to his legitimate line. Each acknowledgement was both a public act of affection and a calculated political maneuver. In this palace, the matter is complicated. The queen has produced one delicate heir, a boy who coughs too much in winter. The mistress has no children, yet, but gossip is already building scaffolding for a possibility that hasn't even happened. You follow the murmur into a smaller withdrawing room. A lady in waiting whispers to another, "She fainted in chapel last week." The second replies, "So did I when I wore that corset." You hide a smile. In court, the line between health and rumour is as thin as the lace on a cuff. Historians still argue whether queens truly feared a mistress's pregnancy or whether the threat was more about perception. A pregnant mistress could gain sympathy, cement her position, and, if the king acknowledged the child, secure influence for decades. Even without legal claims, such children were often married advantageously, strengthening the mistress's extended family. The queen is no fool. Today she receives her ladies in a sunlit chamber scented with rosemary and lemon balm, a deliberate choice, bright, clean, and health-giving. She laughs easily, speaks warmly of the king's charity to the poor, and makes no mention, none, of the rumours. It's a lesson you've learned in this palace. The thing most talked about in the corridors is the thing least spoken of in the presence of the person most affected. A quirky tidbit lands on your shoulder in the form of an old midwife's superstition. In certain courts, if a woman of rank was suspected to be pregnant, her sheets would be sprinkled with dried marigold petals for joy. The trouble was, marigolds also made an excellent moth repellent, so sometimes the presence of petals meant absolutely nothing, except to the people desperate to find meaning in everything. Meanwhile, the mistress plays her role with expert care. She attends a garden walk with the king, wearing pale silk that floats as she moves, and accepts strawberries from his own hand. She bends to speak to a court child, laughing at a joke, and the watching courtiers nod, already reading maternal grace into every movement. Is it real? Is it staged? Here, those questions are less important than the impression they leave. The king, for his part, seems blissfully unaware, or perhaps entirely aware, of the speculation. He strokes the hunting dog's ears, compliments the strawberries, and speaks of building new stables. No mention of heirs, legitimate or otherwise. But when he places his hand at the mistress's elbow for a moment too long, the room takes note. Historians still debate whether monarchs used such gestures to send messages. In a world without public press conferences, a glance or a touch could be as deliberate as a signed decree. And in a court where every gesture is recorded in someone's mind, the king's hand on a mistress's arm is more than gallantry. It's a tiny, public claim. You leave the garden just as the queen's carriage arrives at the outer court. She steps down, her gown the same blue as the damask in her private room, Section 8, her face as calm as a lake at dawn. She greets the mistress with a smile that is both genuine and unreadable, then links her arm through the king's. The three walk together into the palace, the picture of unity. But if you look closely, you can see how the king's shoulders tip ever so slightly toward the woman in pale silk. By nightfall, the whispers will grow louder. Some will claim the mistress has a certain glow. Others will insist it's nothing but clever rouge. The queen will maintain her composure, the mistress will maintain her charm, and the court will continue its favourite pastime, pretending they know the truth. And you? You'll keep walking these halls, learning that in this palace, even the cradle can be a weapon. The palace feels hushed in the afternoon, the kind of hush that isn't peace but anticipation. You follow the quiet to a narrow stair leading down toward the older part of the royal apartments, rooms where the ceilings are lower, the windows smaller, and the shadows seem to have been here for centuries. It's here you stumble upon one of the least advertised but most potent parts of a mistress's job. She can be the spy in the bedchamber, not a spy in the cloak and dagger sense, no dagger strapped under a gown. This is subtler. In the intimate hours, when the crown is set aside and the council is far away, the king is at his most unguarded. He might complain about a minister, confess doubts about a treaty, even let slip the true state of the treasury. And the woman beside him, if she's clever, listens without ever seeming to listen. Mainstream fact throughout history, foreign powers sometimes sought influence, not just through ambassadors and bribes, but by cultivating ties to a ruler's mistress. In France, England, and several Italian courts, correspondence survives that shows mistresses quietly passing along hints, introductions, or even policy shifts to outside parties. The line between pillow talk and intelligence work was often invisible. Tonight you witness it firsthand, though not in the king's bedchamber. The mistress sits in a small antechamber, a glass of warmed wine in her hand, speaking in low tones to a gentleman whose coat carries the faint smell of sea air. His mask from the masquerade is gone, but you recognize the voice. One of last night's dancers who seemed to know about the flooding at the South Bridge. They talk of shipping routes, of tariffs that might be raised or lowered, and of a certain captain who is angling for a lucrative posting. On paper, it's idle conversation. In reality, each detail is a thread, and the mistress is weaving them together to form a pattern she can use. She doesn't promise anything. She simply says, the king's mind is persuadable if one knows the hour and the angle. Historians still argue whether mistresses in such roles were active agents of policy or simply conduits, carrying whatever they heard to the person they favoured most, be that the king, a foreign envoy, or a faction within the court. But the outcome was the same. Words that might never have been spoken in the council chamber found their way into decisions that shaped armies and borders. A quirky tidbit surfaces from an English court in the late 17th century. A mistress once smuggled a coded letter in the hollow shaft of a quill pen, delivering it to a sympathetic noble during what appeared to be a casual exchange of writing instruments. Here, in this palace, you suspect methods are just as creative, perhaps a folded note tucked into the lining of a music book, or a warning disguised as the choice of a song at an evening concert. The Queen, of course, has her suspicions. She may not have proof, but she understands that the mistress's influence could extend beyond affection. That's why her own network includes not only ladies-in-waiting, but discreetly loyal footmen and laundresses. If a letter passes through the mistress's hands, there's a chance someone in the Queen's service will see it, if only briefly, before it reaches its destination. Tonight, however, the Queen is occupied with a visiting bishop, leaving the mistress free to steer her conversation without interruption. You watch as she leans forward, the candlelight catching the gold thread in her sleeve, and murmurs something that makes the sea-scented gentleman nod sharply. He takes his leave with a bow, the sort of bow that acknowledges a transaction without naming it. When the king arrives later, his mood is light. They dine together in her private chamber, and you hear him mention that perhaps the tariffs could be reconsidered. The mistress smiles, not too broadly, and replies, "I'm sure whatever you decide will serve the realm best." The seed is planted. By morning, it will grow into a policy adjustment that appears to be the king's own idea. You leave them there, the door closing softly behind you. In the corridor, the hush feels heavier than before, not silence, but the weight of decisions being borne in places no official minutes will ever record. In this palace, the council chamber is just the daylight version of the bedchamber, and sometimes the bedchamber wins. By the time the court gathers for the weekly concert in the Hall of Mirrors, the air is thick with the faintest tang of unease. You can feel it in the way servants glance sideways before speaking, in the overly careful compliments exchanged between rivals. The rumour is out, the king's mood has shifted, and when the king's mood shifts, so do fortunes. This is where you see the other side of the mistress's life, when love, conveniency, or politics turns inconvenient. Tonight, she enters the hall in a gown of deep green, the same shade as the velvet in her salon, Section 5. But the green feels different now, less vibrant, as though it's trying too hard to remind everyone of better evenings. Her smile is still polished, yet it doesn't quite reach her eyes. The king greets her politely, not warmly. It's a nuance the entire court catches like a whiff of smoke. Mainstream fact, kings could, and often did, dismiss mistresses with shocking speed. Sometimes it was prompted by political pressure, sometimes by the allure of a new face, sometimes simply because the novelty had worn off. Louis XV replaced one favourite with her own cousin. Henry VIII elevated Anne Boleyn while still married, then tired of her in turn. When a king's favour cooled, the change could be abrupt enough to leave a woman's allies scrambling to protect themselves. Historians still argue whether these dismissals were always the king's decision. In many cases, factions within the court actively undermined a mistress once she'd served her purpose, feeding the king subtle complaints or tempting him with alternatives. The Queen, too, might exert quiet influence, though she rarely had to lift a finger if the mistress had made enemies elsewhere. Tonight's concert programme is nothing unusual. Arias from Italy, a harpsichord suite, a pastoral duet. But in the spaces between the music, you notice the choreography of social distance. The king listens from his high-backed chair, speaking now and then to the minister beside him. The mistress sits 3 seats away, close enough to be seen, but not close enough to whisper. In court terms, that's an entire continent. A quirky tidbit drifts through your memory. In certain French courts, the placement of a lady's chair relative to the king's was so laden with meaning that courtiers would sketch the seating arrangement afterward, comparing it to previous weeks to detect shifts in favour. By tomorrow, you know, some ink-stained secretary will have drawn tonight's seating like a military map. During the interval, she makes her move. Rising gracefully, she crosses the floor to the king, curtsies, and offers him a small folded paper, perhaps a poem, perhaps a note from a mutual friend. He takes it, tucks it into his sleeve without reading, and turns to greet a passing duke. It's not a snub exactly, but it's not the response she wanted. You see her eyes flick toward the Queen, who stands at the far end of the hall, engaged in animated conversation with a foreign envoy. The Queen doesn't look over, but you'd bet she's aware of every heartbeat in this exchange. The mistress retreats to her seat, still smiling, still poised. But the air around her feels different. People approach with polite courtesies, then drift away sooner than they would have last week. Some of her allies are already calculating how to pivot their loyalties if her star keeps dimming. Historians still debate whether mistresses in decline could salvage their position. Some did, by retreating temporarily, by reinventing themselves, or by engineering a grand gesture of loyalty that reignited the king's interest. Others found themselves quietly married off to a noble in need of a dowry, effectively exiled from court under the guise of honour. The concert ends with applause, and the king leaves without offering her his arm. She doesn't flinch. Instead, she turns to a cluster of younger courtiers and begins telling a witty story about last winter's hunting accident, the one where a minister's hat ended up in the stew pot. They laugh, relieved, grateful for her effort to keep the mood light. But when the room empties, you see her walking alone toward the green velvet salon. The door closes behind her, and for the first time since you entered this palace, you wonder if she's rehearsing her exit. In here, love and favour are just 2 sides of the same gold coin, and when it flips, you don't always land on your feet. The corridors are quieter than usual tonight, and not because the court has gone to bed early. This is the hush that happens when curiosity holds its breath. You follow it toward the Queen's inner rooms, the blue damask world from Section 8, where the candles burn lower and the servants step softer, as if sound itself could get someone beheaded. You've spent so long watching queens endure that you might forget they were human under the brocade. But if king and mistress play their bright public game, a different game sometimes unfolds in the shaded margins, where a queen, careful, crowned, catalogued, lets the mask slip for exactly the length of a heartbeat, and maybe, just maybe, a little longer. Mainstream fact to steady your feet. In many European realms, a queen's adultery was not merely a moral failing, it was legally perilous. Because succession hinged on legitimate blood, the charge could be treated as treason, punishable with imprisonment, annulment, or worse. That's why so much of what we think we know about queens' secret comforts swims in rumour, pamphlet venom, and hostile testimony. The stakes made truth shy. Still, people are people, even in palaces, Tonight you find the Queen in her small library where the lamps are shaded, the perfume is rosemary and lemon balm, and the door to the antechamber is left deliberately ajar, etiquette's safety rope. A lute leans against a chair, the instrument of a gentleman who reads Latin well enough to flatter a bishop and sings in a voice that could convince rain to apologize. He bows low, not too low, the exact distance court arithmetic requires. The Queen inclines her head, and somewhere, far off, a ledger, section 4, turns a page by itself. They speak first about the city's new fountain and the guild that funded it. They speak about the poem pinned this morning to the talking statue in the square, section 10. Praise for a patient queen in lines sweet enough to rot a saint's molars. And then they speak about a book, the safest subject, and the most dangerous, because ideas can go where hands cannot. He reads a curious stanza aloud, something about a bird that sings only when no one listens. The Queen's smile arrives late and tiny, like a secret folded twice. Historians still argue whether certain queens, pick your pamphleteer favourite, from Marguerite de Valois to Isabella of France, took lovers or simply collected enemies who sold good stories. Mary, Queen of Scots, is a battlefield of footnotes. Catherine the Great is a bonfire of slanders. Even pious consorts acquired rumours the way white gowns acquire candle smoke. The archive is loud, the facts are shy, and the truth keeps its fan half open. Section 7. A quirky tidbit glints from the edge of the desk. A slender ring, its band plain outside, but engraved inside with a tiny motto, as long as life and breath. These posy rings were fashionable tokens with secret inscriptions exchanged by spouses, yes, but also by friends and occasionally by people who liked their promises private. The Queen rolls it once along the wood and then sets it aside as if it's only a bookmark, which tonight it is. You've learned the choreography of caution here. The Queen's lady-in-waiting sits in the antechamber with embroidery and ears. The door stays ajar. Voices never drop below a certain register. The gentleman stands more than an arm's length away, praising a passage from Seneca, then another from a poet the censors prefer to dislike on weekdays. It is courtly, chaste, and yet charged in the way a stormy day can feel charged even when it never rains. Mainstream anchor number 2. Queens often maintained intellectual salons or devotional circles that gathered learned men and women under the safe canopy of culture and piety. In France and Spain especially, a queen's chapel, library, or charity committees gave her respectable excuses to convene bright minds. Friendship, loyalty, and admiration travelled those corridors, and sometimes, perhaps, something that looked very much like yearning walked a step behind, head down, pretending to study the tile. If a queen ever sought comfort, she did so with a strategist's terror. Pregnancy wasn't only scandal, it was dynastic catastrophe. Midwives' herbals wink in the margins about regimens of prudence, and ladies swore by timing, prayers, and frankly, unconvincing astronomy. You can almost hear a whisper from the nursery. Remember the coral charms, section 4. Protection hung everywhere, against illness, against mischance, against rumour. In these rooms, even the furniture participates in chastity. The gentleman sets the lute aside. He quotes a line about constancy being the crown no one can remove. The Queen replies with a line about governance being the art of sleeping with your eyes open. You offer your first light joke of the night, quietly to yourself, that the court could save hours if they just printed those on cushions. The lute smiles without help. They move to the window. The gardens are blue and silver under the moon, that soft theatre where last week's masquerade turned secrets into choreography. The Queen mentions, in a voice that dents nothing, that tomorrow the King will review the cavalry. The gentleman understands immediately she has said all there is to say about her life by saying something about horses. Some queens did more than read and murmur. One formed a political alliance with a lord who looked at her and saw not a crown but a companion. Another collected poets who sharpened her thoughts into arrows. A third retreated into fierce devotion with a confessor who may have been the only person she spoke to plainly. Historians still argue whether those confessions guarded her or trapped her, whether spiritual solace became a leash for conduct or a shield against slander. In a world that files women under example, privacy is sometimes the only rebellion you can afford. There's the softest knock, 2 beats, a pause, 1 beat, the signal this palace uses when news cannot be delayed without turning into trouble. A lady enters with a folded paper and the expression of someone who has learned to carry storms inside her bodice without getting damp. The Queen reads, "A regiment's pay is behind, bread prices have edged up, pamphleteers have sharpened their woodblocks." She looks out at the moonlit paths and says, almost to herself, "We will sing the Soldiers' March at the next concert." Section 7 taught you that sentiment is policy with a heartbeat. The gentleman nods. "And perhaps a public donation to the bakehouse," he says. "In your name." The Queen's mouth tilts. "In the cities," she answers. Ledger and fan meet again. Your second light joke arrives disguised as common sense. You suddenly understand that a queen's romance, if it exists at all, must be indistinguishable from administration. Flirtation here looks exactly like a well-timed charity. The gentleman asks leave to go. He goes. The door stays ajar the entire time. The lady-in-waiting gathers her embroidery with the speed of someone who has never, not once, dropped a stitch when it mattered. The Queen sits again in the high-backed chair and lets out a breath that counts to 5 before the world hears it. There's power in restraint. There's also loneliness. Quirky tidbit number 2, passing on slippered feet. Some gardens in great houses were laid with wildernesses, small labyrinths of hedges and narrow paths, formally designed but cloistered. They were perfect for pious contemplation, and notorious for private conversations that needed precisely 30 steps of privacy. This palace's wilderness was remodeled to widen the lanes, ostensibly to let sedan chairs pass. Everyone understood the new message: conversations here should be seen. You remember Section 1's reality check that you probably wouldn't survive this game a week, and you admit to yourself that you wouldn't last a day under this kind of scrutiny. The Queen makes it look effortless, which it isn't. She has learned to translate desire into usefulness, affection into policy, and the ache for being seen into the gift of seeing others. That's not sainthood, it's statecraft with a pulse. Historians still argue whether one particular rumour, choose your era, hinted at love or weaponized slander. Was that slim ring on the desk a posy from a friend, a spouse, or a secret? Was the sainted confessor merely a mirror polished to reflect a queen's best self, or a veil for something warmer? You will not know. The archives have their own fan language, and they are very good at keeping it half open. Before sleep, the Queen walks the nursery. The small prince dreams under his coral charms, his cough quiet tonight, the cradle gently touching the rhythm of the room. She smooths the coverlet, and then, impulse or ritual, leans to the window where night leans back. Somewhere else in the palace, pearls are taken off. Section 6. A fan is folded shut. Section 7. Hunting dogs dream of rivers. Section 10. And a green salon counts its friends. Section 5. Here, a woman places her hand on a cradle and decides which song the court will hear tomorrow. Your third light joke pads in on cat feet. If you ever become monarch, install a bell that rings whenever anyone's about to misunderstand you. Then have another bell for when they do it on purpose. The Queen, who has no such bells, simply has patience and a memory that could map a city. She returns to her chair and opens a small book of hours. The candle gutters once, recovers. The pages whisper. Prayer, planning, longing. They blend until they're indistinguishable, and maybe that's the point. The door remains ajar. The antechamber breathes. The palace, expert conspirator that it is, pretends to sleep. Outside, the wilderness paths gleam faintly with dew, widened and watchful. Inside, the Queen reads the last line on the page and closes the book with a sound like a promise kept. The next morning, the air in the great gallery is brittle, the way it feels just before a goblet tips over, but hasn't yet spilled. Word has spread faster than the fire in the kitchens last winter. There's been a scandal. Not a rumour, not a whisper, but a real, tangible blunder that has already slid under the palace doors and into the streets. It began, so the story goes, with a letter. Not the harmless kind about poetry or pears, but a note between the king and his mistress, warm, indulgent, perhaps too specific, intercepted before it reached her hand. Historians still argue whether it was stolen by a political rival, accidentally misplaced by a servant, or leaked by someone in her own circle angling for her downfall. What's certain is that the letter now circulates in the wrong places, each retelling adding a pinch more spice. Mainstream fact, in the 18th century, such correspondence could topple reputations overnight. The infamous affair of the diamond necklace in France wasn't about a letter, but proved how easily scandal could ruin not only individuals, but whole regimes. A single, well-timed piece of evidence, true or forged, was enough to ignite public outrage, especially if the court's finances or morality were already under scrutiny. You watch as the mistress arrives for the king's levee. She's wearing a gown of pale gold that should catch the light beautifully. But the light feels sharper today, more like a knife. Courtiers step forward to greet her, but a few hesitate just half a beat too long before bowing. That half second is everything. It says, "We're watching to see if you survive this." The king greets her warmly enough, though you notice he keeps his voice low. If he's angry, he hides it well. If he's embarrassed, he hides it even better. But his eyes flick toward the Minister of Police with the kind of glance that says, "Find out how this happened and do it quietly." A quirky tidbit you overhear from an old chamberlain. In some courts, sensitive letters were written in mirror script, inked backwards so they could only be read when held to a mirror. It sounds clever until you remember how many servants handled correspondence and how many mirrors sat in the palace. A secret that relies on furniture for protection is not much of a secret. The Queen is nowhere in sight during the morning rituals. Some would take this as a sign she's above such pettiness. You suspect it's more strategic, letting the king and mistress manage the immediate mess without her presence becoming part of the spectacle. Later you hear she spent the morning visiting the cathedral where she was seen praying with quiet dignity. If you were to put it in the language of Section 4's ledger, you'd call that depositing public sympathy. By midday, the story has morphed into several versions. In one, the letter was nothing more than an affectionate note. In another, it contained details about a military deployment. Historians still debate how often scandal was deliberately inflated for political gain, but here you can see the inflation happen in real time. The mistress retreats to her green velvet salon, Section 5, summoning a small circle of her most loyal allies. She reads the actual letter aloud, light, teasing, completely harmless, except for the fact that it's undeniably from the king. The allies laugh, reassure her, and suggest that the whole thing will pass in a week. She nods, smiling. But you notice she keeps her fan in her hand, opening and closing it, as if counting the rhythm of each person's voice. This is where the survival work begins. The first step, control the narrative. She arranges for a poet to write a flattering verse about the king's tender heart, which will be read at supper, as though it's about his generosity to orphans. The second step, deflect attention. She sends a lavish basket of pears, Section 7, to the family of a recently injured soldier, ensuring the gesture is noted in tomorrow's court bulletin. The king, for his part, plays the public game flawlessly. At the evening banquet, he calls her to sit beside him, offers her a slice of orange, and laughs at a joke she makes about the harpsichord's stubborn tuning. The courtiers note this too. It signals that whatever happened, she's still in favour. But you can feel the shift under the marble floor. Scandals are like hairline cracks in porcelain. You can smooth them over, but they don't disappear. The Queen will file this in her ledger, the ministers will file it in their memories, and somewhere in the city, a satirist is already sketching a cartoon. When the banquet ends, the mistress lingers in the hall, speaking to a few friends before slipping away. Her smile is still bright, her gown still perfect, but her eyes, they're measuring the room, counting chairs, taking note of who laughed and who didn't. Because here, survival isn't about avoiding trouble, it's about knowing exactly how much of it you can afford, and who will still stand beside you when the music stops. By the next week, the letter scandal, Section 15, has cooled on the surface, though you can still hear its echo in the way courtiers lower their voices when the mistress passes. But rather than retreat into her green velvet salon, she steps forward into a different battlefield, one far less tangible and yet far more enduring. This is the territory where mistresses become cultural icons. The palace gardens are in bloom, the air heavy with lilac and freshly turned soil. The king strolls beside her, not in full regalia, but in a lighter coat, his hat tipped back just enough to look approachable. They pause near a marble fountain, and a painter, summoned by chance, sets up his easel. This isn't just about a portrait, it's about freezing a mood, planting an image in the collective mind. Mainstream fact: royal mistresses throughout history often shaped more than private life. They influenced public taste in fashion, architecture, literature, even language. Madame de Pompadour popularized pastel interiors and porcelain figurines. Charles II's mistress, Nell Gwyn, sparked trends in theatre and witty repartee. Diane de Poitiers' preference for black and white gowns rippled through the French court for years. Here, today, the mistress wears pale blue silk embroidered with silver thread, a colour not yet fashionable but soon to be. You can almost hear the scribbling in dressmakers' notebooks. Even the shade of ribbon tied around her wrist will be imitated by half the court before month's end. Historians still argue whether such trends were spontaneous expressions of taste or carefully crafted tools of influence. A popular colour or hairstyle could be more than vanity. It could act as a signature, a quiet way for allies to signal loyalty in public without speaking a word. A quirky tidbit arrives in the form of a fan-shaped brooch she pins to her gown. It's enamelled in the same hue as her silk, a gift from an artisan whose career she championed when the royal jeweller refused to take apprentices from outside the capital. By wearing it today, she sends a layered message. She has taste, she rewards loyalty, and she can make a craftsman's work as visible as the king's own seal. Her influence extends beyond fashion. That afternoon, she hosts a poetry reading in her salon, inviting not just courtiers, but playwrights, painters, and 2 astronomers who've been bickering over the best way to chart the moons of Jupiter. She listens with real interest, asks clever questions, and, more importantly, makes sure the king hears the most flattering pieces when he arrives. One of the astronomers will leave with a royal commission for a mural in the observatory. Everyone will know whose introduction made it happen. This is where the queen's and mistress's realms occasionally overlap. The queen supports charitable works and public rituals. The mistress shapes the aesthetic of the moment. When the two align, when the queen opens a new orphanage and the mistress ensures the uniforms are in her favoured pale blue, the court feels a rare sense of harmony. But harmony here is always temporary. You catch sight of the queen at the poetry reading. She's dressed in deep rose silk, her jewels restrained but flawless. She compliments the mistress on the event, the compliment returned with equal grace. In public, they are 2 women whose tastes complement each other. In private, each is aware of how style can shade into influence and influence into power. Historians still debate whether such cultural sway could outlast political favour. Some mistresses remained style icons long after their romantic role ended. Others vanished from memory the moment their gowns went out of fashion. The key seemed to be weaving one's tastes into the fabric of the court itself, so that removing them would feel like pulling a thread from a tapestry. As the evening ends, the painter from the garden reappears, showing the king a quick sketch of the fountain scene. The image captures the mistress in mid-laugh, sunlight glinting off the silver in her gown. The king approves it for a full portrait, to hang not in his private chambers, but in a semi-public gallery. That single decision will ensure that guests from across the continent will leave with her image fixed in their minds. Walking back through the corridors, you realize that scandals fade, but style lingers. And in this palace, style isn't decoration. It's a form of diplomacy, a language in silk and colour and carefully chosen ornaments. The mistress knows this, and so does the queen. The only question is who will speak it more fluently in the months to come. Morning bells rinse the city in sound, and the palace wakes to incense on a draught. You trail those bells toward the chapel, where the air remembers every whispered promise made to God at midnight and edited by breakfast. Candles nudge the shadows back. A boy's voice trembles through the Kyrie. Somewhere in a side aisle, a courtier prays for a promotion with the sincerity of a drowning man asking for a towel and a yacht. Today the sermon is on fidelity. Of course it is, and you brace yourself for the elastic theatre of conscience at court. The preacher ascends the pulpit with an hourglass ticking beside him, a literal one, turned by a beadle in case zeal forgets time. Quirky tidbit: many early modern pulpits kept sandglasses to keep sermons from lasting until the bread went stale. The truly gifted preachers learned to accidentally turn it twice. He thunders about marriage as a sacrament, about vows as steel, about beds as altars where promises are renewed. Heads bow, fans pause mid-whisper. You try not to look at the king, mainstream fact to anchor your feet. Early modern Europe saw church and monarchy dance an intimate, complicated minuet. In Catholic realms, post-Council of Trent Catholicism tightened rules on marriage and penance. Bishops like Bossuet and Bourdelot preached austerely at Versailles, even as Louis XIV maintained very public favourites, before later embracing a more devout life with Madame de Maintenon. In Protestant England, Charles II's Restoration Court flaunted mistresses while the Anglican hierarchy mostly sighed and focused on order, liturgy, and not lighting the country on fire again. Doctrine said one thing, royal practice often another. You watch the message work the room like a slow dye in silk. The Queen sits serene, blue damask self-composure pressed to perfection. Section 8. The mistress kneels with measured humility, no crushed cherry drama today, a sober dove grey that reads as I listen. The King's expression is politely attentive, the look of a man who knows the text by heart and prefers the footnotes. When the preacher reaches, "Kings must be examples," the flock collectively inhales. The preacher, no fool, glides into "Kings must be merciful," and releases everyone by degrees. Historians still argue whether sermons at court were honest correction or ritualized absolution. Were Bossuet's stern addresses genuine moral pressure on the Sun King, or a carefully staged conscience that left policy and private life intact? Did Restoration bishops ignore Charles II's loves because the Church of England was still stitching itself back together after civil war, or because rebuking a charming king with a packed theatre schedule felt like picking a fight with gravity? The archive supplies both thunder and silence. After Mass, the line for confession coils like ribbon along a choir stall. The Queen's confessor, grey-haired, precise, moves with the efficiency of a good clerk and a kind physician. The mistress's chaplain, younger, waits in a side chapel beneath a painting of Magdalene that looks suspiciously like a fashionable brunette of the season. The artist always manages his model list with an eye to devotion and flattery. The seal of confession is absolute. Outside the box, however, everything rustles. "She cried," someone whispers. "He promised," another counters. You've learned by now, at court, even silence has a rumour. You slip into the palace oratory when the crowd thins. The Queen kneels alone, choral charms from the nursery still threaded through your memory. Section 4. Her prayer is a ledger written in breath. Keep the city fed, keep the child well, keep the crown steady. She does not pray for the king to be different. She prays for the kingdom to survive exactly who he is. That is not resignation, it is strategy in Latin. The mistress chooses a different liturgy. She sponsors a mass for the poor in a riverside parish, sending sugar loaves and, yes, pears, our kitchen diplomats from Section 7, to the bakehouse afterwards. The parish priest preaches that charity covers a multitude of sins. The pamphleteer outside sketches a cartoon suggesting which sins exactly. She understands the equation. If sermons cannot spare you, alms might soften the edge. It's not hypocrisy, It's calculus within sense. Mainstream anchor number 2, royal mistresses often traded on piety as well as pleasure. Madame de Pompadour funded convent repairs and artisans' chapels. Madame de Maintenon ran the school at Saint-Cyr for noble but poor girls and pushed Louis XIV toward devout routine. In Spain, Habsburg piety staged elaborate public devotions while gossip stitched private stories along the seams. Across confessions, the monarchy's public religion was a stage set that had to hold, no matter what rehearsals looked like after hours. Our preacher returns in the afternoon for a Lenten conference in the Queen's apartments. The hourglass appears again, its sand bright as ground bone. He speaks gently of order, of the household as a mirror of the state, of women as stewards of peace. The Queen's ladies stitch, the needle tips glinting like tiny swords. The Queen asks one question about bread prices. The preacher promises to thunder about charity on Sunday. "Gently, father," she says, smiling. "Thunder makes men deaf." You file that line for the cushion embroidery we keep threatening to start. Your first light joke sidles in here. You imagine issuing the palace a spiritual blue hour, Section 7, wherein sermons may only be delivered sotto voce and everybody must hold a cup of chocolate so they can't clap too hard. It would halve the scandals and double the sugar budget. Win-win apart from the dentists. The king, sensing the day could use a peace offering, orders the chapel choir to learn a soldier's hymn before next week. Sentiment as policy, just as we saw in the Queen's Midnight Plan, Section 14. He also asks that a Te Deum be sung if the bridge is repaired before the hunting party, a neat trick of piety that turns engineering into thanksgiving. When piety and logistics hold hands, the city sleeps better. The double standard is not subtle, it is architectural. A noble woman caught in adultery risks exile, a convent, or an unwanted marriage arranged with the speed of a broom after a spill. A king glosses with a donation, a pilgrimage, or a chapel refurbishment, and sometimes a change of favourite. Does the church flinch? Sometimes, but cathedrals are expensive. Altars don't gild themselves. You don't have to admire the arrangement to see how it endures. Historians still argue whether confessors to kings served as brakes or accelerants. Did they nudge rulers toward reconciliation with their queens, or did they soothe consciences enough to keep the machine humming? Madame de Maintenon is the contested emblem. Did she reform Louis XIV into faithful, aging domesticity, or simply regularize an intimacy already there by a morganatic marriage and a stricter household routine? Footnotes duel, portraits smile primly. The truth, as usual, keeps a fan half open. A tiny procession passes your memory. The talking statue in the square, Section 10, wore a pinned verse this morning. Someone rhymed virtue with curfew and got away with it, which is both brave and unforgivable. The Queen allowed it to stand. The mistress sent the poet a better rhyme scheme via a third party and a coin. Every altar has a side chapel. Quirky tidbit, second course, the confessional booth, with a fixed wooden screen ubiquitous in your mental picture, was standardized after Trent, pushed by reformers like Charles Borromeo to guard modesty and prevent familiarities. In some older chapels of this palace, though, you still find a pre-Tridentine niche. No screen, just a priest's chair, near a pillar, and a lot of trust. The court prefers the screen. It cuts less temptation and more rumour. Afternoon wanes. The Queen sponsors Vespers for the Guild of Bakers. Public gratitude braided with prayer. The mistress lights candles in a side altar to St. Joseph, patron of workers and people who must quietly perform miracles on deadlines. The king shows up for the last hymn, sings in a tuneful baritone you did not expect, and kisses a relic with sincere lips that have not always been used for strictly devotional purposes. The crowd approves. The hourglass is turned. The sand says mercy is seasonal. The city says, as long as the ovens stay hot. Your second light joke arrives like a psalm refrain. If piety were measured by the size of the candlesticks, this court would ascend bodily every Tuesday. A sacristan glares at you from 1672 evening. The palace slips into its own compline. The blue hour softens voices, windows crack open, the scent of lavender returns, Section 3. In the green velvet salon, Section 5, the mistress hosts a small reading from St. Francis de Sales on gentleness. In the Queen's Library, the confessor helps plan a procession for the Foundling Hospital. Different books, same hymn. The music of survival is written in parallel lines, and still the double standard hums like a basso continuo. A lady is counselled to forgive and forget. A gentleman is counselled to remember confession and increase alms. A pamphlet calls the Queen a saint and the mistress a storm. Tomorrow another pamphlet will call the saint a hypocrite and the storm refreshing to stale sails. Section 10 sonnet knew that tune. You wonder how anyone breathes beneath so many verdicts. Historians still argue whether public devotions masked private rot or genuinely reformed the powerful in their later years. Louis XIV's late piety, Philip II's austere routine, England's periodic moral crackdowns, were these policy, penance, or optics? The sources mix diary tears with treasury ledgers. The reader is left to sort incense from smoke. Night draws the line under the day. The Queen pauses at the nursery, fingers the coral charms, and murmurs a blessing older than doctrine. The mistress douses her candles, leaving the tiny votive before a travel-sized Madonna burning like a secret that is allowed. The King lingers in the chapel, alone for a moment, and touches the cold rail, a man who knows that crowns weigh more honestly in the dark. Your third light joke pads in, whispering, "If you had to print a catechism for this palace, question 1 would be, what is the chief end of public religion?" Answer, to keep God, the people, and the pamphleteers just mollified enough that the bridge gets fixed. It's flippant and also not wrong. The bells retire, the hourglass lies on its side. Piety has done its rounds. Politics will pick up the watch at dawn. Between them lies a corridor smelling faintly of beeswax and roses where echoes of hymns bump into the soft click of a snuff-box. Section 9. The double standard doesn't sleep. It merely dreams itself into something that sounds like harmony. And in the morning, the city will call that dream tradition. The palace wakes to the clatter of boots in the main courtyard. Not the measured tread of a guard change. This is sharper, more deliberate. You lean over the balustrade to see a line of officers in polished breastplates, their cloaks snapping in the spring wind. The King is reviewing his cavalry today, and that means more than horses and salutes. In this court, military decisions can be as intimate as a whispered conversation over wine. You trail the royal party down the marble steps. The mistress is there, in a riding habit of deep navy trimmed with silver braid, practical enough for the parade ground, but tailored so perfectly it might as well be a coronation gown. The Queen arrives separately, flanked by 2 ladies-in-waiting, her gown in the same rose silk you last saw in Section 16, a quiet reminder that she holds her own space in the visual theatre. Mainstream fact, throughout European history, royal relationships sometimes bled directly into military policy. A favourite's family could receive lucrative supply contracts, military commissions, or governorships of strategic regions. During the 30 Years' War, mistresses in both Catholic and Protestant courts were known to advocate for particular generals, or, just as effectively, to whisper doubts about others. Historians still argue whether these interventions were decisive or merely convenient excuses for choices already made. Did a king change a battle plan because his mistress's cousin stood to gain, or because the plan was already sound and the personal tie simply made it more appealing? The sources rarely admit to either outright. Today, you watch the mistress work the field with the same tact she uses in the salon. Section 7. She greets a colonel whose regiment recently distinguished itself, offers a few words about the bravery of his men, and then, almost casually, mentions a young captain of particular promise. It's an elegant move. Praise the group, spotlight the individual, and let the king overhear. The Queen plays her own game. She speaks to the quartermaster about the new stables, inquiring if the grain stores are sufficient. It's not just small talk. Shortages in feed could embarrass the crown if the army falters. By focusing on logistics, she positions herself as guardian of the realm's practical strength. the counterpart to the Mistresses' focus on morale and personal connection. A quirky tidbit from an older war, one French mistress once commissioned a set of embroidered saddlecloths for the King's Guard, each stitched with her personal emblem. It looked like a gift of splendor. In reality, it was a branding exercise, ensuring her presence rode into every engagement. Here, you notice the mistress's navy habit carries a small silver knot on the cuff, the same design worked into the harness of the king's own horse. Coincidence? Not in this place. The inspection proceeds in a blur of gleaming tack and shouted commands. The king rides down the line, the mistress at his right hand, the queen watching from a raised platform. At one point, the king pauses to speak with a major whose estate borders the mistress's family lands. Later, you hear he has been offered command of a new frontier garrison. The official reason will be merit, the unofficial reason may be as simple as proximity. Historians still debate the ethics of such appointments. Was it corruption, or was it just the reality of monarchy, where personal trust mattered more than anonymous recommendations? In an age when generals could and did betray their sovereigns, a personal tie, whether through marriage, blood, or the bedchamber, was sometimes seen as insurance. By midday, the parade is over. The Queen descends from her platform to offer the King a silk handkerchief, a public gesture of support that will be noted by every eye. The mistress follows with a flask of spiced wine, a private indulgence that will be noted by every tongue. The King accepts both without hesitation, the picture of a man who can balance two worlds without toppling either. But you've been here long enough to know that balance is temporary. In the palace, a military appointment can ripple outward for years, rewarding one faction, angering another, altering the map in ways no cartographer can record. And sometimes the first step of a campaign isn't taken on the battlefield at all. It's taken in the space between a king and the woman riding at his side. The spring sunlight in the parade ground, section 18, has barely faded from memory when the court wakes to another kind of spectacle, one that turns the entire hierarchy upside down for a few breathless weeks. Word has spread, the king intends to marry his mistress. It's rare, but not without precedent. Mainstream fact, in the history of European monarchies, mistresses occasionally ascended to queenship, though the path was never simple. In France, Françoise d'Aubigné, Marquise de Maintenon, secretly married Louis XIV after the death of Queen Maria Theresa, though her influence had long been established. In England, Anne Boleyn began as Henry VIII's favoured lady before becoming queen and losing both crown and life. The transition from mistress to wife was a dangerous alchemy. It could elevate a woman beyond every rival, but it could also place her under a microscope no affection could shield her from. Historians still argue whether such marriages were born of love, political calculation, or a monarch's stubborn refusal to bow to custom. In most cases, they were all three at once, stirred into a potion potent enough to rattle every pillar of the court. Here, the announcement comes not in a formal decree, but in a wave of small, undeniable signs. The mistress's apartments are redecorated in colours traditionally reserved for the Queen's household. Her carriage bears a new crest, subtle, but not so subtle that anyone could miss it. The King receives foreign envoys with her at his side, introducing her in tones warm enough to melt the stiffest diplomatic bows. The Queen's reaction is studied silence. She continues her public duties, mass, audiences, charity visits, without a single comment to suggest upheaval. But her ladies note that she has begun spending more time in her private library, her correspondence thicker than usual. If Section 4's ledger has grown crowded, she isn't showing anyone the latest entries. A quirky tidbit surfaces from an older court. When Louis XV's former mistress, Madame de Pompadour, died, some joked that she had been queen in everything but name. Here, that line circulates with a twist. Queen in everything and name, though always spoken just quietly enough to deny intent if challenged. The court reacts like a forest at the first crackle of flame. Some rush to align themselves with the rising power, offering gifts, flattery, and convenient memories of past loyalty. Others hedge, maintaining ties with both the Queen and the soon-to-be bride, unwilling to gamble everything on a single outcome. A few, mostly older nobles, mutter darkly about tradition, as if tradition hasn't been bent here more times than a ribbon on a dancing day. Historians still debate whether queens displaced by a royal marriage from mistresshood ever truly accepted the change. Some, like Catherine of Braganza, endured their husbands' infidelities without open rebellion. Others, like the first wife of Henry VIII, fought until exile or death. In this palace, the queen plays the long game. She neither resists publicly nor embraces privately, ensuring that any misstep in the new union will not carry her name on it. The mistress herself moves with deliberate caution. She moderates her wardrobe, still elegant, but less daring, knowing that every gesture will now be measured against the standards of queenship. She begins attending more religious observances, sitting near the queen during major feasts. It is part public relations, part personal survival. You witness a dinner where the three of them, king, queen, and future queen, share a table. The king is in high spirits, recounting a hunting tale. The queen listens, smiling faintly. The mistress laughs at the right moments, but never louder than the king. Every move is calibrated. It is the most cordial triangle you've seen since this story began, but the air is dense with unspoken terms. By night's end, the king announces that the wedding will be in due season, and the court exhales like a held breath. Due season could mean weeks, months, even years, but the shift has begun. And in this palace, once a shift begins, the floor never tilts back exactly the way it was. The morning after the king's due season announcement, Section 19, the palace breathes like a person who has decided not to cry in public. Courtiers speak more softly. Footsteps turn into ellipses. You follow the hush to a winter garden glazed with old glass, where citrus trees stand in tubs like dignified dowagers. Here, under leaves the colour of polished malachite, two women who are supposed to dislike each other have decided to survive instead. The queen arrives first, punctual as a psalm. She wears that deep rose silk you've learned to associate with steadiness. Section 16. The soon-to-be bride, let's not say mistress, in a room full of oranges, enters second in dove grey with a narrow ribbon of pale blue at the wrist, a whisper of the colour she launched last week. They exchange the kind of bow that could be printed in a manners book. Then they sit. No witnesses, except the gardener pretending to prune and you pretending to admire limes. Mainstream fact to anchor this improbable tableau. More than once, queens and royal favourites forged functional, even cordial alliances. Catherine de' Medici tolerated and manoeuvred alongside Diane de Poitiers, who'd been Henri II's great love. After the death of Maria Theresa, Louis XIV's household grew around Madame de Maintenon's pious influence, with court women cooperating in devotional projects under her lead. These arrangements weren't friendships in the modern sense, they were treaties, stitched with ribbon instead of seals, but treaties nonetheless. Today's agenda begins with bread. Of course it does. The Queen opens with the Foundling Hospital's accounts, that ledger from Section 4 humming like a beehive, and the bride nods, offering to fund the bakehouse repairs in the King's name. The Queen smiles in that quiet way that says she recognizes a good sentence when she hears it. You can feel the room exhale. If Section 15 taught you that scandal cracks porcelain, Section 20 shows you gold lacquer. They move to protocol. The Queen outlines the calendar of major feasts when the royal women appear together, and the exact choreography of entrances, who leads when the doors open, who pauses on the second step, so the court has time to register what unity looks like. The bride listens, memorizing the geometry. She suggests gently that her blue livery be muted at chapel so it doesn't clash with the Queen's household colours. The gardener trims the air a little, impressed. Historians still argue whether these alliances came from personal warmth or cold arithmetic. Did Catherine see in Diane a capable administrator of Henri's energy, or merely a useful lightning rod? Did Maintenon soothe the old king into piety because she loved him, or because a devout court stayed calmer and safer for everyone? The archive, obligingly ambiguous, lets both readings live. A servant arrives with a plate of pears, our recurring diplomats, section 7, and 2 porcelain cups of thick chocolate, cooled to a saintly drinkable temperature. The Queen thanks the bride for sending sugar loaves to the river parish after Vespers, section 17. The bride returns, thanks for the soldier's hymn added to the choir book, also section 17. Compliments pass like well-folded letters, no corners sticking out. Quirky tidbit peeks from the citrus leaves. A tiny orange tree wears a ribbon tied in a lover's knot. The gardener's superstition, the Queen explains with a ghost of laughter. If the knot holds till harvest, the tree will bear sweet. The bride touches it lightly. Then we should double the knot, she says, and the gardener, an old conspirator of plants, pretends not to grin. Their conversation slips from charities to optics to the trickiest topic of all, the child. The Queen speaks of the prince's cough and the coral charms above the cradle, section 4. The bride listens without reaching for the air. He is the kingdom, the Queen says, not melodramatic, just factual. And he is a little boy. The bride asks permission to send a physician who has a good reputation for winter lungs. The Queen nods, once measured, and something delicate and real crosses the space between them like a moth that has decided astonishingly to trust a candle. Your first light joke arrives like a breeze under the greenhouse panes. You make a private note that national reconciliation is apparently 2 parts charity, 1 part calendar, and 1 part citrus management. Add chocolate, whisk until glossy. Alliances need ritual. So they schedule a shared visit, Queen and future Queen, to the Guild of Midwives. It is perfect politics, women helping women under the banner of keeping babies alive. The Queen will lead, the bride will present new linens, the choir will sing something sturdy enough to make even stern grandmothers dab their eyes. Pamphleteers will be forced to choose headlines like Virtue visits the cradle instead of Court plays musical chairs, which is a mercy to typography, if nothing else. Do these arrangements actually work? Sometimes astonishingly well, sometimes they buy only a season of quiet. Historians still argue whether Diane de Poitiers' partnership with Catherine stabilized Henri II's reign or planted resentments that later burst into the wars of religion. You've learned to suspect that both can be true, a peace that holds until history grows teeth. They stand. The Queen offers the bride her arm, not as equals exactly, but as co-architects of a facade the country desperately needs to see finished by winter. As they walk, you spot details blooming like annotations. The Queen's fan carries the bride's blue in a single painted ribbon, Section 7's language upgraded to a treaty clause. The bride's gloves, subtly embroidered with the Queen's favourite orange blossom, Section 4's composure, scented into fabric. Objects become footnotes to behaviour. On the way out, the hunting dogs, Section 10, tumble into the walkway, leashes a hopeless theory. The Queen laughs like a bell, the bride kneels so perfectly she could fix a country at eye level. The dogs adore indiscriminately, a quality that would improve several ministries. By afternoon, they've moved the alliance into the open, hosting a small blue hour, Section 7, salon together, windows unlatched, candles moderated, conversation low, warm and careful. The guest list is half Queen's circle, half brides, a mathematician, a bishop with decent jokes, the widow with ships, an apothecary who refuses to sell fake relics because he prefers his lies scientific. The king drops by, sees the chairs arranged so no one has to choose sides, and relaxes visibly for the first time in days. This, more than affection or policy, is what these alliances purchase: breath. Mainstream anchor number 2, collaborative patronage by royal women left literal architecture behind. Foundations for hospitals, schools for girls, think Saint-Cyr under Maintenon, dowry funds, all stamped with names that once contested a seat at the king's right hand. When rival women sponsored the same project, the stone tended to go up faster. Competition, domestic edition, not everyone applauds. A hard-eyed duchess whispers that amity is weakness. A swan-necked cousin predicts disaster because prophecy is just envy in Latin. they're not entirely wrong. Alliances shift risks instead of erasing them. If the bride stumbles, say by favouring a cousin who cannot stop embezzling, the queen will be accused of complicity. If the queen asserts too much at a shared event, enemies will call the bride a puppet. This is a three-legged race on marble. Your second light joke taps its way in. You imagine issuing the court ankle bells. If anyone pulls too far, you'll hear the jingle and pass out pairs until tempers normalise. Evening brings the test. At supper, the seating chart places the bride to the king's right and the queen opposite, a geometry that could spell rivalry in capital letters. Instead, they run a quiet relay. The queen raises the subject of the cavalry's winter stabling costs, section 18. The bride praises the quartermaster's efficiency and suggests a public thanks from the king on review day. The king, who enjoys feeling magnanimous on schedule, agrees. A minister who looked prepared to object discovers that he adores gratitude when it arrives with dessert. A musician performs a new air. The bride requests the soldier's hymn. Here's section 17. The queen asks for the old lullaby the king's mother loved. Nostalgia, then duty, then comfort, an emotional triptych that leaves the room softened like wax near a candle. You don't need a sandglass to time it. You could do it with the human pulse. Quirky tidbit number 2. A fashion note creeps in at the edges. Matching posy rings, section 14, inscribed inside with mottos that rhyme when read together. The queen's reads, hold fast. The bride's, walk light. If anyone notices they are wearing them on different hands, no one says so. In a palace where meaning loves disguise, the rings shine like two quiet verbs. Will this alliance last? Historians still argue whether such truces endure beyond the initial crisis. Some dissolve with the next rumour, others calcify into custom so thoroughly that later generations call it tradition and forget it was born of necessity. The only honest answer is that alliances, like citrus trees, require tending, loosen the soil, water evenly, prune pride, harvest before frost. The night closes the winter garden's panes. Before they part, the queen offers the bride a small, unremarkable shawl, a loan for the draught, she says. You remember section 8, gifts that look like kindness can also be hierarchy, spoken in Kashmir. The bride understands, accepts, and thanks her with a bow exact to the centimetre. It is not subservience, it is choreography. They walk out together. The corridor receives them with that respectful hush palaces use when they approve of their occupants. Behind them, ledgers balanced, ribbons knotted, dogs reconciled, pairs diminished by honest consumption. Ahead, pamphlets sharpening quills, ministers adjusting faces, a city deciding what story to tell itself at market dawn. Your third light joke ambles after them. Somewhere, a pillar is sketching tonight's seating and congratulating itself on being the most stable thing in the building. Don't ruin its confidence. You linger a moment with the oranges. The gardener reties the lover's knot just a touch tighter and says to no one, "Sweet needs help." In this place, even the trees know statecraft. And for now, at least, 2 women have agreed to water the same roots. The shawl from section 20 is barely folded away when the next challenge arrives, not with a trumpet blast, but in the faint rustle of parchment. You're in the royal library, the air dusted with the scent of vellum and candle soot, when the king's secretary hurries in carrying a letter bound in green silk. Green is never casual. It's the colour the foreign ministry uses when dispatches contain news that might rearrange seating charts, borders, or both. The secretary presents it to the king, who breaks the seal with the nonchalance of a man used to good surprises. This is not one. His jaw tightens. Our allies wish to renegotiate the treaty, he says, voice level enough to be dangerous. The treaty in question, mainstream fact here, was signed decades ago, a defensive pact with a neighbouring kingdom that also happened to be ruled by the king's cousin. Marriages between the courts have kept it alive, stitched together with dowries and banquets, but everyone knows the stitching phrase when the right wind blows. This wind? A rumour that the cousin's court disapproves of the king's impending marriage to his mistress. Historians still argue whether such diplomatic snubs were genuine outrage or convenient excuses to extract better terms. The cousin's envoy insists it's about stability and public perception. You suspect it's about tariffs on salt, but salt never sounds romantic in a dispatch. The Queen reads the letter, her face carved from composure. The bride-to-be reads it after, slower, lips pressed into a line. This is the first time she's seen her personal life inked into the language of statecraft. It's one thing to navigate the court's opinion, another to see your name, well, your role, in a list of grievances that might cost the kingdom an ally. Quirky tidbit, in the 17th century, one French mistress reportedly helped draft letters to foreign courts defending her position, sprinkling them with enough flattery and cultural references to soothe offended monarchs. Whether she succeeded diplomatically or simply delayed the inevitable, historians still argue, but her handwriting in the archives is, without question, excellent. Here the king decides the matter needs a dinner. Not a formal council, too stiff, but a private meal with both the queen and the bride present. He believes, perhaps naively, that if they show unity in front of the visiting envoy, the treaty will hold. The preparations begin immediately. You watch as the queen and the bride coordinate again. The memory of their winter garden alliance, Section 20, still fresh. The menu is chosen with surgical precision, no imported delicacies that might suggest dependence on the cousins' ports, no wines from the rivals' vineyards, a dessert featuring local honey, which the envoy is rumoured to favour. Even the seating is strategic, the envoy between the two women, so he must turn toward both equally. On the evening of the dinner, the table gleams like a diplomatic instrument. The candles are tall but unperfumed. Scent can be interpreted as favouritism, believe it or not. The queen wears deep blue, the colour of the royal arms. The bride wears a paler shade, signalling harmony. The king? He wears satisfaction like a cloak. The envoy arrives, bowing just low enough to satisfy etiquette, without surrendering pride. He glances between the women, perhaps expecting frost. Instead, he is greeted with warmth that feels practiced, but not brittle. The queen inquires after his mother's health. The bride compliments his choice of cravat, which happens to match the green silk of the dispatch. Flattery, it seems, travels faster than ships. Over the first course, the conversation drifts toward safer topics: harvest yields, the restoration of a cathedral roof, a new breed of hunting dog said to retrieve ducks without shaking water on the royal boots. The king laughs, and for a moment the treaty seems solid again, but the envoy eventually circles back to the marriage. "My master worries," he says, "that such changes might unsettle the order we've maintained for decades." The queen leans in slightly, her voice as soft as it is precise. "Order is not a fragile porcelain," she says. "It is a tapestry. It gains strength with each new thread." The bride follows without hesitation. "And I am not here to unpick the weave," she adds, "only to take my place in the pattern." You can almost hear Section 20's citrus trees nodding approval from across the palace grounds. The envoy studies them both, perhaps reassessing the advantages of two women who can speak in metaphor while passing the butter. The main course arrives, a roast prepared with a spice blend unique to this kingdom, and he allows himself a second helping. It's not a signed treaty, but in diplomatic terms, it's progress. Historians still debate whether this dinner was the turning point in the marriage's acceptance abroad, or merely a polite pause in a longer quarrel. The archives record that the treaty was renewed the following spring, with minor concessions on both sides. What they don't record is the quiet satisfaction of the queen and the bride, sharing a glance as the envoy took his leave, each knowing the alliance they'd begun in a winter garden had just steadied a piece of the kingdom's future. Later that night you pass the library again. The green silk dispatch lies folded on the king's desk, now weighted with a small sprig of dried orange blossom. You can't tell whether it's the queen's doing or the bride's. Perhaps that's the point. Morning returns like a polite knock rather than a sunrise, muted, steady, slightly cautious. The air in the palace carries the faint smell of last night's spice blend. Section 21. A lingering reminder that diplomacy has been simmering alongside dinner. You find yourself back in the Queen's apartments, where the day begins not with courtiers but with parchment and thread. The Queen is seated at a large embroidery frame, silk floss spilling from a polished walnut chest. Today's pattern is a hunting scene, but if you look closely, the stag's antlers curl in a way that echoes the royal crown. Symbolism stitched in silk, another form of statecraft. Across from her, the bride-to-be is writing a letter on cream paper thick enough to stand up by itself. She pauses to sand the ink before adding a flourish to her signature. Mainstream fact for this quiet moment: letter writing among high-ranking women in early modern Europe was both art and politics. Queens and mistresses alike used personal correspondence to manage alliances, soothe rivalries, and send coded messages, sometimes literally, through cipher. Catherine de' Medici maintained an extensive letter network that could mobilize allies or undercut opponents. Madame de Pompadour used her pen to guide foreign policy as deftly as she influenced art commissions. The bride's letter is headed for the cousin's queen, the woman whose approval could soften or sour the treaty renewal, Section 21. The tone is warm, almost domestic, an inquiry after her children, a compliment on the recent chapel renovations, a discreet mention of the new midwives' fund, Section 20, as an example of shared values. Nowhere does she mention the impending marriage directly, but the subtext is woven like the Queen's stag, undeniable once you see it. Quirky tidbit: the sealing wax for this letter smells faintly of rosemary. Supposedly the herb strengthens memory, but here it's more likely a private joke. The bride once sent the Queen of a rival court a sachet of dried rosemary to remember me kindly, which was either warmly received or politely ignored, depending on which historian you believe. By mid-morning, the two women leave their work and walk the palace's long gallery. It's lined with portraits, each king more bearded than the last, each queen balancing dignity with whatever elaborate hairstyle was fashionable at the time. As they pass, the Queen points out her own likeness, painted years ago before the lines at the corner of her mouth deepened, before she learned to measure silences in political minutes. The bride studies it, then glances at the blank space left for the next Queen's portrait. Neither says anything, but the echo of that pause stretches farther than the gallery itself. They arrive in the small council room where the king is meeting with two ministers. A stack of petitions waits on the table, requests from guilds, monasteries, and the occasional ambitious inventor who believes he's solved the problem of smoky chimneys. The Queen takes the petitions concerning domestic policy. The bride asks for those tied to the arts. It's a division that feels both practical and symbolic. One tends to the hearth, the other to the stage. Historians still argue whether such divisions of influence were intentional strategies or simply the natural outcome of personal interests. Did queens steer toward domestic affairs because they chose to, or because the court politely walled them in? Was a mistress's patronage of the arts a deliberate political tool, or just the safest way to build legacy without provoking the treasury? The answer, unsurprisingly, depends on which historian you ask, and whether they've had their coffee. A soft laugh from the bride breaks the council's tension. She's reading a petition from a troupe of actors who wish to perform a play based on a thinly veiled version of last year's royal hunting accident, Section 10. The king frowns, the queen raises an eyebrow, the bride suggests commissioning a different play instead. Something flattering to the crown, perhaps a romance where the king rescues a noblewoman from pirates. No one dislikes pirates, she adds. You make a note to file that under universal truths. Light joke number 1. You imagine the pirate scriptwriter being handed notes from the bride. More heroism, fewer historically accurate diseases. And sighing into his ink pot. When the meeting ends, the king leaves for the tilt yard, and the women return to the Queen's apartments for a quieter lunch. Over poached eggs and early strawberries they discuss the envoy's likely report. The Queen predicts a cautiously positive tone. The bride wagers on a deliberately vague one, designed to keep options open. They agree, at least, that neither will be surprised if the cousin's court sends a gift in the form of a visiting relative, a living emissary with opinions on marriage and salt tariffs. the afternoon brings an unexpected diversion, a delivery from the palace armory. 2 ornate fans, their guards and sticks carved from pale wood, each with a hidden metal rib. They are gifts from the master of the guard, who claims they're for defense in case of crowded receptions. Quirky tidbit number 2. Weaponized fans did exist, though mostly as curiosities, more likely to bruise pride than skull. The bride twirls hers experimentally. The queen folds hers with a snap, sharp enough to make the chamberlain flinch. Light joke number 2. You privately rate the queen's fan snap as effective deterrent against both pickpockets and poor conversation. Evening falls, and with it the palace's habit of turning corridors into rivers of candlelight. The queen hosts a small supper for her ladies, inviting the bride to join. Conversation flows easily, embroidery patterns, the merits of different harpists, whether the palace ghost prefers the west or east wing, section 12. It's an unremarkable evening by court standards, but you recognize its quiet utility. Every shared laugh tonight is a thread in the alliance they've been weaving since citrus season. Before they part, the queen offers the bride a small silver box. Inside is a pair of pearl drop earrings, modest by royal standards. For the portrait sitting, she says, as though it's already settled. The bride accepts them with the same measured grace she's been perfecting, aware that in this palace even pearls can be a paragraph in the unwritten treaty between 2 women. Light joke number 3 drifts in as they exchange farewells. You imagine the court's chronicler trying to decide whether to list the earrings under gifts or diplomatic instruments, and eventually settling on miscellaneous, the historian's version of a shrug. The night ends with the sound of the queen's embroidery frame creaking faintly as she returns to her stag crown pattern. Somewhere else in the palace, the bride's rosemary-scented letter is cooling under a pool of sealing wax. 2 different crafts, one shared purpose to keep the weave from fraying. Dawn comes with a thin veil of mist across the palace gardens, softening the sharp edges of statues and turning the gravel paths into ghostly ribbons. You follow the faint hum of voices to the Queen's private gallery, where a painter's easel has been set up near the tall windows. The long-delayed portrait sitting is finally here. The Queen stands beside the bride-to-be, both in gowns that seem chosen to say, "We coexist and we know you're watching." The Queen's deep burgundy silk has the sheen of old wine. The bride's soft cream satin catches the morning light, throwing a faint glow on her face. Mainstream fact. Joint or parallel portrait sittings like this were rare, but when they occurred, they were deliberate theatre. A painter's brush could do more than capture likeness. It could reinforce a narrative. Historians still argue whether portraits of rival women in court were meant as propaganda for harmony or as subtle competitions frozen in oil. You can see the argument here, in miniature. The Queen's steady gaze versus the bride's half-smile, the pearls from section 22 dangling like punctuation. The painter, a court favourite, works with the serene arrogance of someone who knows that posterity will judge his skill, and perhaps his diplomacy, by how this canvas turns out. He fusses with a drape behind them, muttering about visual unity, which you suspect is painter code for, "I'm not risking anyone saying one looks better lit than the other." Quirky tidbit. In the 16th century, a Spanish court painter once painted 2 women on opposite ends of the same canvas without ever letting them sit in the room together. Here, at least, there's no such theatrical separation, just the faint tension of shared space. Between brushstrokes, conversation meanders. The Queen speaks of an upcoming harvest festival. The bride asks the painter about his pigment sources, earning a miniature lecture on crushed lapis lazuli for blues and cochineal insects for reds. Light joke number 1, the bride feigns alarm at the idea of wearing insect red, then admits she already has, just under a different name. As the sitting stretches on, the Queen grows stiller, her ability to maintain composure under scrutiny honed by years in the public eye. The bride shifts occasionally, not out of nerves, but to adjust the fall of her skirts, mindful that in the final image, a wrinkle in satin might be read as a wrinkle in character. The king arrives mid-morning, claiming he only came to see the progress, but you notice how he lingers. His attention moves between the two women like a pendulum: pride, curiosity, and something else you can't quite name. When the painter asks him to stand behind them for a reference sketch, he declines with a laugh. "Let them shine without my shadow," he says. Historians still argue whether he meant that as magnanimity or subtle mischief. By midday, the painter calls a pause and the Queen suggests a short walk. They cross the courtyard to the kitchens, a place the bride has been visiting more often lately. There's a new confectioner in residence. His specialty is sugared citrus peel dipped in dark chocolate, a treat that somehow manages to recall Section 20's orange blossoms while also hinting at the richer indulgences of queenship. Like joke number 2, the confectioner insists his creations are healthful because fruit is involved, though the chocolate coating could sink a ship anchor. While sampling, the Queen inquires after the progress of the rosemary-scented letter from Section 22. The bride says no reply has come yet, but the courier's return is expected within the week. They exchange the kind of glance that suggests both hope and readiness for disappointment. In the afternoon, the court hosts a small poetry reading in the long gallery. The Queen sits near the hearth. The bride chooses a chair closer to the windows, where the weak sunlight filters through the painted glass. The chosen verses speak of loyalty, change, and the endurance of old walls, hardly subtle. Whether the poet selected them for relevance or simply because they rhyme well with hall, you can't say. Quirky tidbit number 2. In one 18th century court, poets were paid extra for verses that could be read two ways, one flattering to the monarch and one plausible as purely artistic. That tradition seems alive here, judging by the occasional sideways glances during applause. As dusk falls, the painter returns for a few more sketches, this time focusing on their hands. He arranges the Queen's fingers lightly on the arm of her chair, the bride's resting in her lap. No rings beyond the necessary, no ornaments to distract from the symmetry. Light joke number 3. You half expect him to add a symbolic olive branch between them, but perhaps even he knows when to stop layering meaning into pigment. When the day ends, the partially finished portrait leans against the wall. Two women, side by side, lit in a way that flattens neither and flatters both. The lines between them are clear yet somehow softened, much like the mist over the gardens that morning. The Queen departs first, her footsteps measured. The bride lingers a moment longer, looking at the canvas as though trying to read her own future in the brushstrokes. In this palace, pictures don't just hang, they speak, and once hung, they rarely stop speaking. The portrait from Section 23 remains propped in the gallery, its paint still damp enough to catch the light in tiny, oily glints. Overnight, it has already become a quiet attraction. Pages carrying trays slow their steps to glance at it, and guards stationed nearby seem to adjust their posts so they can see more clearly. In a place where gossip travels faster than official messengers, a portrait can become its own news bulletin. This morning, however, the Queen is not in the gallery. She's in the council chamber, seated at the head of a long table draped in green baize. Before her lies an array of folded papers, each sealed with a blob of crimson wax. They are reports from the provinces, harvest yields, grain prices, murmurs about local unrest. Mainstream fact: queens in many European courts were often entrusted with domestic stability while kings handled external affairs. This division wasn't always official, but it was practical. The king's absence on campaign or in diplomacy left someone to keep the home fires and tax collections burning. Across the table, the bride-to-be listens as a steward reads aloud from the more delicate reports, those not written plainly enough for a casual glance. One letter notes a sudden increase in tavern songs mocking the king's busy household. Historians still argue whether such public jests were signs of harmless wit or dangerous dissent. The Queen's eyes don't flicker, but her pen moves in a neat line. Send a new troop, playful but loyal. Quirky tidbit: in one 17th century court, a particularly bold ballad about the king's mistress was answered by a rival song composed at the Queen's command, turning the scandal into a kind of lyrical duel. Here, the Queen's approach is subtler: flood the streets with cheerier tunes until the old ones fade from memory. Light joke number 1. drifts through your head. Somewhere, a group of musicians is about to be handed a royal commission, titled "Please Distract the Public" in C major. By midday, the king joins them, bringing with him the scent of horse and leather from the tilt-yard. He listens to the reports with half his attention, his other half clearly fixed on a parchment in his pocket. When the queen finishes her notes, he pulls it out. A reply from the cousin's queen to the rosemary-scented letter of Section 22. The letter is courteous but non-committal, praise for the palace's cultural achievements, polite interest in the upcoming harvest festival, no direct mention of the marriage. Historians still argue whether such silences were meant to leave room for later negotiation or to signal quiet disapproval. Here, the king calls it cautious optimism. The queen calls it careful avoidance. The bride, after a pause, calls it exactly what we expected. They break for lunch in the smaller dining chamber, where a platter of fresh figs sits beside a wedge of pale cheese. Light joke number 2, the king insists the cheese is aged perfectly, which you suspect is his way of saying old enough to cost twice as much. In the afternoon, the bride turns her attention to the festival preparations. She tours the outer courtyard with the master of revels, inspecting the timber frame for the temporary stage. The queen joins halfway through, pointing out where the wind tends to whip hardest, a reminder from Section 11's disastrous tent collapse. Quirky tidbit number 2. In certain Renaissance festivals, stages were deliberately built with concealed trapdoors, not for dramatic exits, but to whisk away unlucky performers who forgot their lines. You wonder whether the master of revels here has similar tricks planned. As evening approaches, the palace begins to glow in layers. First the torches along the walls, then the chandeliers dripping light over the marble floors. Tonight's entertainment is an informal concert in the music room, a space panelled in dark wood that seems to drink the candlelight. The queen sits near the harpsichord. The bride chooses a spot where she can see both the performers and the door. The musicians play a mix of courtly dances and softer airs, some so slow they seem to stretch the minutes like warm honey. At one point, a violinist leans into a melody that feels almost too intimate for a room of 40 people. Light joke number 3. You briefly suspect he's serenading someone specific, though with the acoustics here, he's probably serenading everyone at once. After the concert, the queen and bride linger together by the door, speaking in low tones. From the fragments you catch, they're discussing which visiting nobles to seat together at the festival banquet, a delicate art that can mean the difference between a lively evening and a diplomatic frost. By the time they part for the night, the portrait in the gallery is alone again, the wet paint drying imperceptibly. Tomorrow it will be moved to the audience hall for final inspection, and once it's hung, it will join the silent ranks of images that watch this palace change without ever blinking. By the next morning, the scent of varnish clings faintly to the air in the audience hall. The portrait from Section 23 has been installed with quiet ceremony, no trumpets, no speeches, just the subtle shuffle of footmen adjusting its position by an inch here, a breath there, until the light from the high windows brushes both faces evenly. It's remarkable how still a room can feel when 2 painted women seem to be looking at you at once. The queen arrives first, her steps deliberate, as though she's inspecting more than brushwork. She stands before the painting for a long moment, her gaze travelling from the carefully rendered folds of her gown to the faint glimmer of the bride's pearls. Mainstream fact. Once a royal portrait was unveiled, its placement could speak as loudly as its content. A central position above the audience dais signalled prominence. A side wall meant secondary importance. This one hangs just to the king's right, close enough to command attention without overshadowing the throne itself. Historians still argue whether such positioning was the result of etiquette manuals or private negotiations. Here, you suspect both. The queen nods once, satisfied. Not long after, the bride steps in. She tilts her head, studying her own likeness, then the queen's. There's a flicker of a smile, not triumph, not defiance, just an acknowledgement of having stepped onto the same wall where history lives. Quirky tidbit. In one 18th century court, Portraits of royal mistresses were sometimes displayed in private salons, visible only to select guests. This public placement is a declaration in itself, though, as the king would later remark over wine, it saves visitors the trouble of asking where she is. Like joke number 1, you can almost hear the gossips now. Why, they look so harmonious in the painting. It must be true. By midday, the hall fills for a small reception. Nobles file in, each offering carefully measured compliments on the portrait, followed by equally careful questions about the upcoming harvest festival. The Queen fields these with her usual composure, while the bride offers bright, seemingly effortless remarks about the decorations and entertainments. The king moves between them, a living bridge, but he never lingers too long in one spot. You notice how often his gaze returns to the portrait, as though checking that it hasn't shifted in the few minutes since he last looked. In the afternoon, a messenger arrives with a bundle of letters tied in blue ribbon. One is from the cousin's court again, this time a formal acceptance of an invitation to the festival. Historians still argue whether such acceptances were signs of genuine reconciliation or tactical appearances to gather more information. The Queen, reading the letter, murmurs, "At least they'll see the portrait for themselves." Quirky, tidbit number 2. In some courts, the unveiling of a portrait could be timed to coincide with a diplomatic visit, allowing the subject to control the first impression before a single word was spoken. Whether that's the case here or not, the coincidence feels too neat to be accidental. Late in the day, you drift through the palace kitchens, where preparations for the festival are already escalating. Copper pots hiss with spiced wine, trays of sugared almonds cool in neat rows. A kitchen boy hums one of the cheerful tunes commissioned in Section 24, the melody bouncing off the stone walls. Light joke number 2. The song's refrain is so relentlessly upbeat, it could probably survive a siege. By evening, the audience hall is quiet again. The Queen passes through on her way to a meeting, pausing only briefly to adjust the fall of her sleeve in the painted version of herself. The bride follows a short while later, alone, her steps echoing in the high space. She stands before the portrait without speaking, tracing the air just below the line where her painted hand rests in her lap. Somewhere deep in the palace, a clock strikes. She turns, skirts whispering against the marble, and is gone. The painting remains, lit by the last threads of sunset, holding its silent pose, a fixed harmony that, for now at least, matches the living one. Light joke number 3. If portraits could sigh in relief, this one would. Morning light combs the palace courtyards into neat stripes, and you wake to a rumour with a spine. The Queen plans to change something that isn't supposed to change. Not a gown colour, not the sequence of a procession, rules, the kind written into the walls in invisible ink, enforced by glances and seating charts and 1,000 small, "We've always done it this way, Esansiti." You follow the current toward the Privy Gallery, where the Queen stands with a slim bundle of papers, and that particular stillness that means motion is imminent. On a side table sits the shawl she lent in Section 20, folded precisely. Beside it, a sprig of dried orange blossom, someone's little memo that sweetness can be archival. The bride, the nearly Queen, arrives moments later. No fuss, no fanfare. 2 women with the floor under their feet and the future in their hands. Mainstream fact to anchor you. In multiple European courts, consorts occasionally redefine their role, expanding from decorative piety into administrative authority. In early modern Spain, queens consort acted as regents with real teeth during absences or minorities. In France, Anne of Austria ruled as regent for Louis XIV through the Fronde. Later, Maria Theresa of Austria, a sovereign, yes, but also a wife and mother, professionalized a court that had expected merely ceremonial womanhood. These weren't side notes, they were edits to the manual. Today's edit begins with a schedule. The Queen proposes a standing council hour every 3rd morning devoted to household and people, chaired by herself, attended by the Master of Revels, the Lord Steward, the City Provost, and, here's the bend, the bride. Not as an ornament, not as a listener in dove-coloured silence, but as a voting presence on matters of bread, festivals, hospital endowments, and any public-facing pageant that can go wrong in front of a crowd and 50 pamphleteers. The king, wandering in with the smell of saddle soap from section 18, raises an eyebrow and a smile. If it keeps the ovens hot and the streets humming in tune, he says, why not let the best musicians conduct? You watch the room tilt and then right itself. The Lord Steward clears his throat in the international language of "this is new." The city provost, who has counted riots more carefully than beads, brightens at the thought of rapid decisions that don't wait 3 weeks for a duke to return from hunting. The Master of Revels silently calculates whether trapdoors, section 24, can now be installed without 9 signatures. The Queen simply lays down the first docket: grain barges delayed by silt, a leaking roof at the Foundling Hospital, a playwright with too much talent and not enough restraint, and the rumour that hawkers are selling caricatures of the portrait, section 25, that make the bride's pearls look like they could strangle a horse. Historians still argue whether such women's councils were genuine power or clever camouflage, authority granted where the men were grateful to be rid of the aggravation. But results are results, and bread is bread. The Queen's rule change isn't about ceremonial precedence, it's about response time. Minutes, not months, she says, and writes it at the top of the page as if she's christening a ship. They start with the barges. The bride maps a festival calendar, section 24, against the river's temper. If grain misses the key by the feast day, the city will sing satire in the key of hunger. She suggests staging a public blessing for the dredgers, soldiers' hymn included, section 17, so Labour carries pride instead of complaint. The provost nods as if someone opened a window. The Queen signs the dredge order and adds a purse for overtime. That's one fire damped before it finds straw. Next, the hospital roof. The Queen shifts funds from the velvet budget, yes, that velvet budget, and the bride offers a lottery of sugared citrus peels, section 23, where every losing ticket is still a token for bread at participating bakeries. Let the sweets pay for shingles, she says, and you make a private note that governance works best when it sounds like a proverb. Your first light joke arrives wearing a steward's face. He worries aloud about precedent, and you picture a shelf groaning under the weight of previous bad decisions, each labelled "Do Not Touch" in 3 languages. The Queen replies, "We are making a better one." Somewhere, a pillar, section 20, sketches the moment and underlines it twice. Then the playwright. The Master of Revels produces 2 pages, so sharp they could shave the king's dignity. The bride proposes a trade, commission the playwright for the pirate romance she floated in section 22, pay double if he agrees to lock the satire in a drawer until the festival is concluded. Call it an artistic fast, she says. The Queen adds a patronage clause, 3 performances gratis at the Foundling Hospital courtyard. The king, liking pirates and children and not being mocked, grins. The rule here is simple: bend energy into usefulness before it snaps and stings. Mainstream anchor number 2, formalizing female authority, inevitably provoked counter-theatre. In France, pamphleteers blamed Anne of Austria for Mazarin's policies. In England, queens who hosted salons were accused of cabals. In Habsburg realms, pious governance was sometimes slandered as meddling in men's spheres. The backlash was part of the pattern: widen the doorway, defend it, normalise the traffic. The caricatures, quirky tidbit city ordinances in more than one capital-taxed satirical prints, at a higher rate than devotional images. The Queen instructs the provost to enforce the tax strictly, then commissions the same printers for a series of market saints, woodcuts of bakers, porters, wet nurses, each with a halo and a caption thanking them for the festival's success. Give them something better to print, she says. Ink likes profit more than outrage. While the council scribbles, you notice the bride's fan today isn't enamel, section 7, or perfumed, section 6, but paper, cheap enough to scribble figures on the back between breaths. She does, then tucks the scrap into the docket. Paper fan, paper law. It feels right that this new rule is written on something that can move air. A messenger arrives with a green silk knot on the dispatch, section 21's cousin colour. The visiting relative will indeed attend the festival. He is charming, picky about wine, and averse to innovations that unseat the traditional. The Queen smiles with the kind vigilance of a cat noticing a new chair. "And we will seat him on tradition," she says, "and serve the innovations for dessert." Your second light joke slips through the crack. Imagine a menu: first course, custom, second, precedent, third, pragmatism in syrup. You'd eat it. Now the part that makes or breaks a rule: put it in public. The Queen and bride announce a mourning of the people on the festival's second day. A short open audience for guild leaders, midwives, Section 20, and parish wardens. Matters strictly of bread, roofs, and street order. The King will attend the beginning and the end. The middle, where lists are made and actions assigned, belongs to the women. The pamphleteers will call it sentimental. The hungry will call it timely. The guards will call it less rioting. Historians still argue whether such staged openness was transparency or spectacle. But you've watched enough Blue Hours and Masquerades, Sections 7 and 10, to know that theatre is how this palace thinks with its eyes. If the rule can hold on stage, it stands a chance off it. As they finalise the session, a footman delivers a narrow box. Inside, a plain signet. No gems, just the royal cipher, and a tiny orange blossom carved in the corner. Authority, scented like Section 20. The Queen presses it into warm wax on the new council order. Then she hands the stick to the bride. "Co-seal," she says. There's a small intake of breath from the room. 2 impressions in the same puddle of wax. A neat metaphor, a risky one. Also now, the law. Quirky tidbit number 2 tiptoes in. Some courts kept daybooks listing who sealed what, when, down to the quarter hour, less for accountability than for future blame assignment. You can picture today's entry. Third morning, bread and roofs council established. Seals, Q, B. Somewhere a clerk underlines the B and wonders if his grandchildren will care. News spreads like saffron in warm milk. In the kitchens, the boy with the unstoppable jingle, Section 24, adds a verse about the Queen's hour that rhymes loaves with gloves, which isn't perfect, but is strong enough to carry through doorways. In the guardroom, a veteran shrugs with approval. Fewer delays mean warmer boots. In the portrait hall, Section 25, a maid dusting the frame says, "It suits them," to no one in particular, and to everyone who will repeat it. Backlash arrives on cue. A duchess with eyebrows like spears wonders aloud if petticoat councils will start deciding troop movements. A pamphlet claims the Queen plans to ban card games after supper. A bishop's secretary mutters about Eve and apples with a confidence untroubled by horticulture. The Queen doesn't answer the duchess. The bride sends the bishop's household a crate of pears, Section 7, each tagged for temperance. The pamphlet meets the tax collector before it meets readers. Afternoon thins into that familiar lavender seam, Section 3. The Queen walks the nursery. The choral charms knock softly like applause, Section 4. The bride visits the rehearsal on the temporary stage. The master of revels shows her the trapdoor with a conspiratorial grin, and you realise safety and mischief can share a hinge. The King, from a balcony, watches the river dredge boat, bite and spit and bite again, turning mud back into trade. Your third light joke pads in with the hunting dogs, Sections 9 and 10, who have learned the new routine. Bark at the taxman, wag at the baker, nap during policy. If only ministers trained so quickly. Night brings the first test. A sudden shower slaps the city. The festival stalls must be moved under the arcades, or the breads will turn to soup. In the old rule book, this would require 3 messengers, 2 delays, and a prayer to whichever saint keeps rain off pastry. In the new rule, the provost knocks once, the Queen says arcades, the bride says candles twice as many, and the master of revels pulls the trapdoor lever on a plan that hides weather like a coin. An hour later, the stalls are dry, the crowd is pleased, and a poet pins a resh verse to the talking statue. Section 10. She moved the market like a fan, and bread stayed bread. Historians still argue. Whether tonight is a hinge, history will bother to oil. Perhaps it's a footnote, a domestic tweak in a century roaring with war. Or perhaps the ability to keep loaves crisp in a storm is the sort of governance that prevents the next war from recruiting the whole city. The archive likes cannons. The street remembers umbrellas. Before sleep, the Queen rereads the docket and draws one last line. Minutes, not months. The bride at her desk writes a brief to the cousin's queen. Our festival proceeds, roof mended, river clearing. Come see how we do ordinary things quickly. No brag, just bread. Down the corridor, past the audience hall where the portrait holds its fixed truce, the palace hums like a hive correctly smoked. The rule hasn't broken anything. It has relieved strain you didn't know the building was carrying. You pass the privy gallery, the shawl still sits folded, the orange blossom brittle as sugar. Beside them, a copy of the new order waits for the clerk, sealed in double wax, 2 marks, 1 message. When the rules don't fit, women who have learned to live inside them will sometimes reach out and tailor. And if anyone asks tomorrow whether the realm felt different tonight, you'll answer simply, the bread was on time, the roof held, and the music started when it should. In palaces and cities both, that is the feeling of rules rewritten and accepted, not fireworks, breath. The morning after the festival's first success, Section 26, the palace wakes to a mood that is neither triumph nor rest. It's vigilance in comfortable shoes. The air smells of damp wood from last night's rain, bread cooling on its boards, and faint orange peel, courtesy of the bride's habit of tucking slivers into her sleeve. Today's current runs toward the royal chapel. The king has announced a special service of thanksgiving, not unusual after a public triumph, but the guest list hints at something more. Seated in the choir stalls will be not only the high clergy and the court grandees, but also the baker's guildmaster, the provost of the foundling hospital, and the master of the river dredgers. It is, in the court's eyes, an oddly mixed stew. Mainstream fact to set the scene, in several European courts, kings occasionally used religious services as subtle political theatre. Louis XIV's Te Deum celebrated military victories but also showcased his personal piety. In England, royal thanksgivings after plagues or riots doubled as reminders that stability flowed from the monarch's hand. Here, the king's thank you to the city's working backbone is both gesture and signal. The crown has noticed who kept the festival standing. Historians still argue whether such inclusions were sincere gratitude or strategic optics. Sincerity and strategy, after all, often dance in the same shoes. The Queen arrives in dove grey silk, not the brighter festival hues, and wears the coral charms, Section 4, as a quiet callback to the beginning of all this court manoeuvring. The bride enters moments later in deep green, the colour of the river barges now running on time. They sit on either side of the king. If yesterday's double seal was the formal act, today's seating is the public stamp. The quirky tidbit comes with the sermon. The bishop quotes an obscure saint who once blessed a fishing net and declared that every knot is a covenant. The court, always eager to interpret, murmurs about whether this is a nod to the new household council. Every knot a duty, every thread a link between ruler and ruled. You suspect the bishop may simply have liked the fishing metaphor, but in politics meaning is in the eye of the overhearer. After the service, the procession routes through the outer courtyard instead of the usual inner one. That means the guild representatives stand shoulder to shoulder with velvet-caped dukes as the king pauses to speak with each in turn. The bride does the same, asking the dredger about his family, the baker about his ovens, the hospital provost about repairs. She doesn't linger, but she doesn't rush either. The Queen, ever the quiet archivist of human detail, makes sure a scribe walks just behind them to record promises so they can be met. Your first light joke comes from the dredger, who tells the king the river has been sulking less since the ladies took an interest. The king laughs and promises to send it a comb for its tangles. Once the formalities end, the Queen calls a small gathering in the long gallery, the one with the east-facing windows that bleach tapestries to pastel. There she introduces the bride to a concept she calls quiet patronage. Instead of public endowments or festival splendor, it's the practice of finding small, steady flows of aid, bread for widows in winter, funds for apprenticeships that never make the broadsheets but cement loyalty like mortar. Mainstream fact, such discreet acts were often the backbone of a queen's real influence. Catherine de' Medici kept a private purse for pensions to widows of officers. Queen Charlotte in England financed botanical gardens and midwifery schools quietly alongside grander public works. These streams of support built a web of personal obligation that no court intrigue could sever easily. Historians still debate whether this invisible influence was more durable than the big public gestures. Here, in this palace, it is clear the Queen sees both as necessary, the theatre to inspire, the quiet stream to endure. The bride listens, nods, and suggests starting with the hospital roof crew. They can repair other public buildings in their off-season if the Crown pays them a retainer. The Queen smiles, adding, "And if anyone asks why, we will say it's cheaper than building new roofs after storms." Your second light joke surfaces when the Master of Revels wanders in, hears the talk of roofs and mutters, "You're spoiling my drama with all this prevention." In the afternoon, the palace returns to its normal hum, but with one small change. The Queen's antechamber is no longer guarded by two liveried footmen alone. There's now a bench for any common petitioner to sit while waiting for an audience. It's a modest piece of furniture, but in a building where chairs signal hierarchy, it's practically a revolution. Quirky tidbit, in some Renaissance courts, even ambassadors stood until the monarch invited them to sit, a moment carefully timed for effect. Here, a plain bench says more than a gold throne ever could. Evening brings another layer. The bride hosts a small supper in her apartments for the festival committee. No nobles, no foreign dignitaries, just the people who handled stalls, musicians, sanitation, and crowd control. She toasts them with spiced wine and sends each home with a wrapped loaf. "Bread," she says, "is the true souvenir." Your third light joke arrives when the king, stopping by, asks if there's enough wine for him. The bride replies, "Only if you're on the sanitation crew," and he plays along, fetching a broom from the corner. By the time the candles are low, the city outside is still buzzing, not with unrest, but with that rarest commodity in a capital, contentment. The bread was fresh, the streets stayed safe, and the roofs didn't leak. Tomorrow there will be fresh problems, but tonight, in the small warmth between rainstorms, the palace has managed to stand not above the people, but with them. By late afternoon, the festival flags hang tired and contented, like robes after Vespers, and your feet take you somewhere the palace rarely admits aloud, the century ahead. The corridors don't change, but the light does, thinner, quicker, edged with the metallic glint of printing presses and, soon enough, cameras. The air that once smelled only of beeswax and orange peel now carries news, ink, coffee, and the faint ozone of a telegraph. If queens and favourites shaped policy with ledgers and fans, sections 4 and 7, the next age will demand new tools and punish old games played too visibly. You drift into a small archive room where the clerks stack pamphlets beside newspapers. The headlines chatter, parliaments rising, constitutions drafted, revolutions that don't ask permission to enter a ballroom. Here you meet the last great royal mistresses, the women who learned to dance on floors that suddenly tilted toward the people. First, a familiar French silhouette. Jeanne Bécu, Comtesse du Barry, stepping into Versailles like a candle too bright for the hour. Mainstream fact, du Barry was Louis XV's final maîtresse en titre, dazzling in the 1760s and 70s, with diamonds and a smile that could uncrease a royal brow. She was no Pompadour in policy, but she steadied a weary king's evenings and, for a time, the court's temperature. Then came 1789, and the floor of France re-levelled with a thud. Mistresses became symbols of waste, palaces of distance. Historians still argue whether du Barry was a frivolous emblem of decay or an easy scapegoat for a storm already brewing, whether the revolution blamed perfume for the price of bread. The Bakers' Guild, if asked, would point to grain, not gowns. You turn a page, and Bavaria tosses its dark curls. Lola Montez strides in wearing scandal like a travelling cloak. Dancer, self-mythologizer, political accelerant, she captivated Ludwig the Stern in the 1840s. When riots grumbled, her presence became a lightning rod. The king abdicated, reforms tumbled from balconies, and Lola took her legend on the road. Quirky tidbit: she toured America, giving moral lectures with a riding whip, which is one way to do TED Talks before microphones. Historians still argue whether she toppled a throne or merely arrived at the moment it was wobbling, making the wobble photogenic. Across the channel, the tone softens from revolution to reputation management. Edward VII, long before his crown, cultivated a reputation as a sporting prince with a crowded social calendar. Enter Alice Keppel, poised, tactful, unflappable. Mainstream fact: Keppel remained his companion for years, smoothing tempers, writing notes, and, according to polite biographers, helping keep the future king's health and schedule within the realm of survivable. She was not a pompadour shaping treatise, but she practiced Section 7's wit as fabric softener with late Victorian starch. The press modernized the court. Rumours no longer vanished into panelling. They leapt onto pages with woodcuts and eventually photographs. A mistress in the age of Kodak needed timing like a locksmith and discretion like a monk. Your first light joke nudges the stack of newspapers. If the 17th century required a fan language, the 19th required an umbrella for the sudden downpour of headlines. You keep walking and the walls pick up a new frequency: microphones, cinema, celebrity. Daisy, Countess of Warwick, tried politics with her parties, hosting radicals and royals in the same room. Some nights, drawing rooms sounded like Section 5's diplomatic salon crossed with a campaign office. Historians still argue whether Daisy's soirees swayed votes or just produced excellent guest lists and worse hangovers. Then there's a name that isn't a mistress in the traditional courtly sense, but an earthquake all the same. Wallis Simpson. Not a bedchamber favourite tucked into a palace annex. A divorcee who catalysed a constitutional crisis and an abdication. She wasn't crowned, but the crown moved around her absence. The modern monarchy, feeling the heat of cameras and parliaments, learned a lesson Du Barry never had to sit for. Private desire now reported to public consent. You can almost hear the Queen's pen from Section 26 scratching minutes, not months, into a new margin. Optics, not opulence. Back in France, a softer epilogue. The Belle Époque nets a few late favourites, whose names nestle more in memoirs than in edicts. They curated taste, gowns, theatres, charities, like Section 16 on a dimmer switch. The difference is the street could now answer back in daily print. A tiara sparkle on Tuesday might reappear as a cartoon on Wednesday. Your second light joke flutters in. The talking statue from Section 10 has multiplied into 1,000 kiosks, all shouting, "Extra!" What changed precisely? Not the human appetite for affection, vanity, or companionship. The scaffolding changed. Constitutions limited kings, parliaments asked awkward questions, budgets were audited instead of politely accepted. Railways and cheap papers dragged court rumour, common carriages. Cameras denied the court its favourite trick, selective memory. The masquerade, Section 10, didn't end. It lost its masks. So the last great mistresses adjusted. Some leaned into philanthropy, hospital wings with their names, reading rooms that didn't require the right surname to enter, scholarships for girls who could diagram a sentence or a galaxy. Mainstream fact: in late 19th and early 20th century Europe, royal companions and high society favourites often laundered their influence into public works that outlived scandal, foundling funds, nursing schools, municipal parks. The ledger from Section 4 migrated from a private desk to a public plaque. But even generosity met a new tribunal: the crowd. Historians still argue whether these works were sincere repentance or reputational hedges. You, having watched roofs mended and bread delivered on time, Section 26, suspect the city doesn't mind motives when the rain stays outside and the ovens stay hot. You pause by a case of curiosities, a fan, stiff with starch beside a silver cigarette case, a sachet of the old ambergris perfume, Section 6, faded to a memory, a pocket, Kodak, compact and unforgiving. Quirky tidbit, early tabloids hired society correspondents to decode who sat where at supper, a mass-market version of the old chair maps. Section 13. Yesterday's gossip turned into tomorrow's circulation figures, and yet, in all the modern clatter, you spot something tender, an echo of the winter gardens knot. Section 20. Alice Keppel in later years, counselling discretion, courtiers learning to say private citizen without rolling their eyes, a queen, pick a country, building quiet patronage into the job description so thoroughly that future biographers will treat it as furniture. The alliance that once required shawls and citrus, sections 20 and 26, evolves into PR briefings and joint appearances at children's hospitals. Less lace, more microphones. Less handwritten rosemary, section 22, more typed communiques. Your third light joke sits down on a velvet bench that's been reupholstered in tweed. If fan language had an update in this era, it would be a press release titled No Comment, which somehow says everything. Do the last great mistresses vanish? Not exactly. They become legible as hostesses, confidantes, friends of the family, the way a masquerade costume turns back into a gown when the lanterns brighten. Some marry quietly. Some live long enough to be grandmothers telling careful stories. Some, like Lola, burn across hemispheres until the oxygen runs out. The role dissolves into a larger culture that has learned to prize the idea of romance in novels and the idea of responsibility in governments. A final debate threads the shelves. Historians still argue whether removing the mistress from the courtly script elevated queens or simply shoved desire underground, where it leaks into subtler channels, advisors, secretaries, rumours with lawyerly vocabulary. Empires shrink, thrones shift, but the human algebra, power-seeking warmth, warmth-seeking power, persists. The difference now is audit trails and headlines. The old fan, section 7, still moves air. It just does so behind a privacy screen with a sign, by appointment only. You step back into the corridor. The portrait from section 25 looks different in this light. Not a monument to a delicate truce, but a prototype. Two women learning to make public work the point rather than the alibi. The last mistresses tell you something the first could not. When the palace learns to share the stage with the city, the glamorous role thins into civics. And that, strangely, is how it survives, transformed into service, into influence that wears sensible shoes. Night edges in. Somewhere a gramophone scratches a waltz that would have scandalized 3 reigns ago, and now just helps people keep time. In the kitchens, the boy with the unstoppable tune, section 24, hums along with it, proof that music ignores regime type. In the chapel, a candle nods to Saint Joseph, who has patiently become patron of plumbers and policy quick fixes. Section 17's deadline miracles deserve an intercessor. In the nursery, still the true centre, choral charms, section 4, glint faintly over a sleeping child, who will, if the world is kind, inherit a crown that is mostly ceremonies and mostly cameras. You exhale. The age of great favourites doesn't so much end as molt. Satin into tweed, salon into fundraiser, scandal into column inches, and, sometimes, at its best, into roofs that do not leak. The palace learns a new language, fewer whispers at midnight, more speeches at noon, less of the spy in the bedchamber, section 12, more of the aide-de-camp with a calendar. It's not as romantic, it is safer. And sleep, finally, becomes possible for more than just those with rooms near the king. You pass a window yawning onto the city. Lanterns bead the river like a patient necklace. Somewhere, a printer inks a plate that will not mention a mistress at all. Just the price of bread, the votes tallied, the weather. Progress, you think, sounds like yesterday's intrigues, becoming tomorrow's footnotes. Behind you, the portrait keeps its peace. Ahead, section 29 waits with modern echoes, how the old game sneaks into celebrity and politics, diluted but recognizable, like a familiar perfume caught on a passing coat on a very different street. The 20th century is loud before it is visible. You hear it first, the thrum of engines, the clatter of typewriters, the snarl of radios tuning past static. And then you see it, the palace's high windows reframing a world with fewer thrones and more headlines. If the 19th century's last great mistresses had learned to survive in a climate of photographs and parliamentary glare, the next generation faces a different challenge entirely. Now, a whispered liaison doesn't just risk an engraving in tomorrow's broadsheet. It risks a newsreel voiceover, a grainy clip playing between footage of a boxing match and a political rally. And yet the archetype refuses to retire. It simply relocates. No longer confined to court salons and velvet antechambers, the role now slips into the orbit of celebrity, politics, and the budding culture industry. You could almost call it the democratization of the mistress, though no one would put that on a campaign poster. Mainstream fact. In the early decades of the century, monarchies dwindled, but heads of state, elected or not, proved equally susceptible to companionship beyond their official spouses. Presidents, prime ministers, even military leaders drew a kind of court around themselves, and in that court, certain figures, actresses, singers, philanthropists, played a part strikingly similar to the royal favourites of sections 3, 7 and 15. The film industry amplifies everything. A starlet photographed at a state function can launch 1,000 rumours. Quirky tidbit. In the 1920s, Hollywood studios sometimes negotiated with foreign embassies about which of their actresses could attend official receptions, lest the wrong pairing send the gossip columns into overdrive. Historians still argue whether these were protective measures or savvy publicity stunts in disguise. You wander through a newly built reception room, sleek lines, polished wood, none of the brocade-heavy drapery of Section 8's Versailles corridors. Here, court looks like a press junket. Instead of a mistress wielding influence over foreign alliances, you might have a silver screen idol convincing the public to buy war bonds. Instead of a queen tolerating the arrangement for political stability, you have a first lady managing both domestic policy projects and the optics of her spouse's friendships. Like joke number 1. In this era, even the bouquet toss is subject to a media strategy. And then there's the realm of politics proper. Think of Eva Perón, Evita, who was no mistress but whose role beside Juan Perón carried many of the same elements: glamour, populist connection, a knack for speaking directly to the people while unsettling the traditional elite. Historians still argue whether her power came from her husband's office or her own charisma. What's clear is that the optics were inseparable from the politics, just as they had been in Section 14's masquerade halls. Elsewhere, royal households adapt by reframing any non-marital companionship in sanitized terms. Close friends, trusted aides, personal secretaries. The lexicon blooms like a hothouse rose, fragrant, undeniable. Cameras are everywhere now, and so is the idea of a scandal bringing down not just a court, but a government. The mistress figure survives as a shadow, present, recognizable, but rarely acknowledged outright. You think of Wallis Simpson from Section 28, whose story belongs to both centuries, an echo of 18th century disruption and a preview of 21st century celebrity politics. She didn't just share the king's attention, she redefined the limits of the monarchy itself. In America, the lines blur differently. The Kennedy era, for instance, carries whispers of affairs with actresses, rumors that today are practically folklore. Quirky tidbit, one such story involves Marilyn Monroe singing Happy Birthday in a way that made half the audience blush and the other half take notes for their own dinner parties. Historians still argue how much of that was real and how much was carefully staged myth-making. Light joke number 2, if medieval queens had to master the art of the polite smile during banquets, modern first ladies have to perfect the unbothered wave during paparazzi ambushes. By mid-century, the palace, whether literal or metaphorical, has learned to outsource discretion. Public relations teams, press liaisons, and eventually entire legal departments take on the work once handled by loyal courtiers with sharp memories and locked desk drawers. In Section 11, a loose-lipped footman could sink a season. Now, a leaked photograph can sink a career. The tone shifts again toward the century's end. The British royal family, under relentless tabloid focus, faces the challenge of keeping private life private. Princess Diana's interviews make clear that the public no longer sees the mistress as a peripheral figure. She is central to the drama, and her presence reshapes public sympathy. Historians still argue whether this was the inevitable result of centuries of tolerated arrangements or a uniquely modern media spiral. Quirky tidbit. In the 1990s, British tabloids coined phrases like Camillagate, blending centuries-old court intrigue with the language of political scandal. That's a linguistic mashup no 17th century diarist could have imagined. Light joke number 3, if Samuel Pepys had lived in the 20th century, he'd have needed a subscription to The Sun just to keep up. By the early 21st century, the traditional courtly mistress has almost vanished, at least officially. In her place, you find high-profile partners who may not be royal but wield similar influence: celebrity couples, political power pairs, billionaires with philanthropist companions. The old dynamics, power, charm, mutual benefit, are still there, but they're framed in interviews and Instagram posts instead of whispered salon gossip. And yet, as you step out onto a palace balcony that now overlooks a city skyline instead of rolling hunting grounds, you can't help but notice the through line from Section 1 to now. Influence thrives where charm meets opportunity, and the rest of the world, whether lit by candle or camera flash, will always be curious. The palace you stand in now is part stone, part scaffolding, part broadcast studio. The past 29 sections have carried you from torchlit antechambers to paparazzi swarms, and here, in the present day, the figure of the royal mistress is no longer a single, unbroken archetype. She's splintered, reimagined, in political companions, celebrity plus ones, influential advisors, and the occasional whirlwind scandal that still manages to make headlines across continents. Mainstream fact: modern constitutional monarchies from Britain to Scandinavia operate under a scrutiny that makes the open maintenance of a mistress impossible by old standards, yet the dynamics, emotional alliances, unofficial counsel, sometimes even strategic marriages after public divorces, still echo the past. Historians still argue whether this shift is a moral evolution or merely a tactical one, shaped by media glare rather than genuine change. In today's world, mistress as a label has mostly vanished from polite vocabulary, replaced by a spectrum of roles: partner, confidant, collaborator, influencer. The Queen in such stories may be a political spouse, a co-CEO, or the public face of a philanthropic empire. And where once the mistress might have wielded influence in salons or hunting lodges, today's equivalent can move markets with a social media post. Quirky tidbit. In 2019, a single photograph of a royal cousin dining with a prominent activist was enough to spike donations to that activist's cause by 400% in a week. That kind of influence would make Madame de Pompadour, Section 7, green with envy, and she managed to sway French foreign policy without Instagram. The king, whether literal or symbolic, now navigates a world where his personal relationships can be passed in real time by millions. There's no safe antechamber to whisper in, no private garden for clandestine walks. Even the private jets leave digital flight records. It's a far cry from the candlelit games of influence in Section 3's corridors. Your first light joke arrives here. Imagine trying to smuggle a love letter today, only for autocorrect to ruin the flirtation before it's even sent. Modern queens too have changed. No longer expected to silently endure, they often command their own spheres of influence, spearheading global causes, shaping diplomatic initiatives, or, when necessary, steering public opinion in the wake of scandal. The old tolerance of mistresses for the good of the realm has been replaced by an expectation of transparency, or at least a convincing simulation of it. Historians still argue if this new arrangement is more honest or just more cleverly packaged. And perhaps that's the unbroken thread. The story is never just about who's with whom, but about how those relationships shape power itself. Quirky tidbit number 2. One modern etiquette guide for political spouses devotes an entire chapter to managing appearances in the age of the lens, a title that could apply as easily to Section 12's court painters as to today's event photographers. By late evening, you find yourself back in a quiet room. No cameras, no courtiers, just the sound of rain on glass. In the corner, stands a portrait from centuries ago. A king, a queen, and a third figure whose identity was once whispered but never recorded. Their faces are calm, as if they know their story will be told and retold, reshaped for each age. Light joke number 3. You suspect they'd be amused to know you've just spent 100,000 words keeping them company. And so the line stretches unbroken, from medieval halls scented with beeswax to modern press rooms buzzing with flashbulbs. The names change, the costumes shift, the rules bend and break, but the dance between love, power, and public perception never really ends. The rain outside softens, becoming more a whisper than a patter. The glass blurs with mist, the city lights beyond blooming into hazy gold circles. In this dimness, the sharp edges of the centuries you've travelled fade into a single, slow ribbon of time. The voices of queens and mistresses alike grow gentler, less insistent, until they are no more than echoes against the vaulted ceiling of memory. You take a breath, feeling the quiet fill in where intrigue once clattered. The carved chairs, the marble floors, the mirrored halls, they are still here, but their weight is different now, lighter, as though the walls themselves are tired from holding so many secrets for so long. In the hush, you can almost hear the low murmur of past conversations. A laugh, shared in a shadowed alcove, the rustle of silk along a gallery, the quick intake of breath before a name is spoken aloud. They are not demanding your attention anymore. They are simply there, settled. The rain slows further. Your breathing matches its rhythm. The portraits on the walls, faces of power, beauty, endurance, seem to soften their gaze, content to be observed without judgment. Whatever they once fought for, whatever alliances they once shaped, it has all settled into stillness. The room feels warmer now, as if the air has decided to stay close, to keep you company. Your eyelids grow heavier, the details of the day blurring like the lights beyond the misted window. You let the stories recede, not out of disinterest, but because they have found their quiet place for the night, and so you stay there in the gentle dark, letting the centuries drift away, until all that's left is the sound of rain, steady and soft.